Section 11 of the Works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, Lectures, Dresden edition, published 1900. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, Superstition, Part 2. What harm does superstition do? What harm in believing in fables, in legends? To believe in signs and wonders, in amulets, charms, and miracles, in gods and devils, in heavens and hells, makes the brain an insane ward, the world a madhouse, takes all certainty from the mind, makes experience a snare, destroys the kinship of effect and cause, the unity of nature, and makes man a trembling serf and slave. With this belief, a knowledge of nature sheds no light upon the path to be pursued. Nature becomes a puppet of the unseen powers. The fairy, called the supernatural, touches with her wand a fact. It disappears. Causes are barren of effects, and effects are independent of all natural causes. Caprice is king. The foundation is gone. The great dome rests on air. There is no constancy in qualities, relations, or results. Reason abdicates, and superstition wears her crown. The heart hardens, and the brain softens. The energies of man are wasted in a vain effort to secure the protection of the supernatural. Credulity, ceremony, worship, sacrifice, and prayer take the place of honest work, of investigation, of intellectual effort, of observation, of experience. Progress becomes impossible. Superstition is, always has been, and forever will be, the enemy of liberty. Superstition created all the gods and angels, all the devils and ghosts, all the witches and demons and goblins, gave us all the augurs, soothsayers, and prophets, filled the heavens with signs and wonders, broke the chain of cause and effect, and wrote the history of man in miracles and lies. Superstition made all the popes, cardinals, bishops, and priests, all the monks and nuns, the begging friars and the filthy saints, all the preachers and exhorters, all the called and set apart. Superstition made men fall upon their knees before beasts and stones, caused them to worship snakes and trees and insane phantoms of the air, beguiled them of their gold and toil, and made them shed their children's blood, and give their babes to flames. Superstition built the cathedrals and temples. All the altars, mosques, and churches filled the world with amulets and charms, with images and idols, with sacred bones and holy hairs, with martyrs' blood and rags, with bits of wood that frighten devils from the breasts of men. Superstition invented and used the instruments of torture, flayed men and women alive, loaded millions with chains, and destroyed hundreds of thousands with fire. Superstition mistook insanity for inspiration, and the ravings of maniacs for prophecy, for the wisdom of God. Superstition imprisoned the virtuous, tortured the thoughtful, killed the heroic, put chains on the body, manacles on the brain, and utterly destroyed the liberty of speech. Superstition gave us all the prayers and ceremonies, taught all the kneelings, genuflections, and prostrations, taught men to hate themselves, to despise pleasure, to scar their flesh, to grovel in the dust, to desert their wives and children, to shun their fellow men, and to spend their lives in useless pain and prayer. Superstition taught that human love is degrading, low, and vile, taught that monks are purer than fathers, that nuns are holier than mothers, that faith is superior to fact, that credulity leads to heaven, that doubt is the road to hell, that belief is better than knowledge, and that to ask for evidence is to insult God. Superstition is, always has been, and forever will be the foe of progress, the enemy of education, and the assassin of freedom. It sacrifices the known to the unknown, the present to the future, this actual world to the shadowy next. It has given us a selfish heaven and a hell of infinite revenge. It has filled the world with hatred, war, and crime, with the malice of meekness and the arrogance of humility. Superstition is the only enemy of science in all the world. Nations, races have been destroyed by this monster. For nearly 2,000 years, the infallible agent of God has lived in Italy. That country has been covered with nunneries, monasteries, cathedrals, and temples, filled with all varieties of priests and holy men. For centuries, Italy was enriched with the gold of the faithful. All roads led to Rome, and these roads were filled with pilgrims bearing gifts. And yet Italy, in spite of all the prayers, steadily pursued the downward path, died and was buried, and would at this moment be in her grave had it not been for Cavour, Mazzini, and Garibaldi. For her poverty, her misery, she is indebted to the Holy Catholic Church, to the infallible agents of God. For the life she has, she is indebted to the enemies of superstition. A few years ago, Italy was great enough to build a monument to Giordano Bruno. Bruno, the victim of the triumphant beast. Bruno, the sublimest of her sons. Spain was at one time owner of half the earth, and held within her greedy hands the gold and silver of the world. At that time, all nations were in the darkness of superstition. At that time, the world was governed by priests. Spain clung to her creed. Some nations began to think, but Spain continued to believe. In some countries, priests lost power, but not in Spain. The power behind her throne was the cowled monk. In some countries, men began to interest themselves in science, but not in Spain. Spain told her beads and continued to pray to the Virgin. Spain was busy saving her soul. In her zeal, she destroyed herself. She relied on the supernatural, not on knowledge, but superstition. Her prayers were never answered. The saints were dead. They could not help, and the Blessed Virgin did not hear. Some countries were in the dawn of a new day, but Spain gladly remained in the night. With fire and sword she exterminated the men who thought. Her greatest festival was the Auto de Fe. Other nations grew great, while Spain grew small. Day by day her power waned, but her faith increased. One by one her colonies were lost, but she kept her creed. She gave her gold to superstition, her brain to priests, but she faithfully counted her beads. Only a few days ago, relying on her God and his priests, on charms and amulets, on holy water and pieces of the true cross, she waged war against the great republic. Bishops blessed her armies and sprinkled holy water on her ships. And yet her armies were defeated and captured, her ships battered, beached, and burned, and in her helplessness she sued for peace. But she has her creed. Her superstition is not lost. Poor Spain, wrecked by faith, the victim of religion. Portugal, slowly dying, growing poorer every day, still clings to the faith. Her prayers are never answered, but she still makes them. Austria is nearly gone, a victim of superstition. Germany is traveling toward the night. God placed her Kaiser on the throne. The people must obey. Philosophers and scientists fall upon their knees and become the puppets of the divinely crowned. The believers in the supernatural, in a power superior to nature, in God, have what they call inspired books. These books contain the absolute truth. They must be believed. He who denies them will be punished with eternal pain. These books are not addressed to human reason. They are above reason. They care for nothing of what a man calls facts. Facts that do not agree with these books are mistakes. These books are independent of human experience, of human reason. Our inspired books constitute what we call the Bible. The man who reads this inspired book, looking for contradictions, mistakes, and interpolations, imperils the salvation of his soul. While he reads, he has no right to think, no right to reason. To believe is his only duty. Millions of men have wasted their lives in the study of this book, in trying to harmonize contradictions and to explain the obscure and seemingly absurd. In doing this, they have justified nearly every crime and every cruelty. In its follies, they have found the profoundest wisdom. Hundreds of creeds have been constructed from its inspired passages. Probably no two of its readers have agreed as to its meaning. Thousands have studied Hebrew and Greek, that they might read the Old and New Testament in the languages in which they were written. The more they studied, the more they differed. By the same book, they proved that nearly everybody is to be lost, and that all are to be saved, that slavery is a divine institution, and that all men should be free, that polygamy is right, and that no man should have more than one wife, that the powers that be are ordained of God, and that the people have a right to overturn and destroy the powers that be, that all the actions of men were predestined, preordained from eternity, and yet that man is free, that all the heathen will be lost, that all the heathen will be saved, that all men who live according to the light of nature will be damned for their pains, that you must be baptized by sprinkling, that you must be baptized by immersion, that there is no salvation without baptism, that baptism is useless, that you must believe in the Trinity, that it is sufficient to believe in God, that you must believe that a Hebrew peasant was God, that at the same time he was half man, that he was of the blood of David through his supposed father Joseph, who was not his father, and that it is not necessary to believe that Christ was God, that you must believe that the Holy Ghost proceeded, that it makes no difference whether you do or not, that you must keep the Sabbath holy, that Christ taught nothing of the kind, that Christ established a church, that he established no church, that the dead are to be raised, that there is to be no resurrection, that Christ is coming again, that he has made his last visit, that Christ went to hell and preached to the spirits in prison, that he did nothing of the kind, that all the Jews are going to perdition, that they are all going to heaven, that all the miracles described in the Bible were performed, that some of them were not, because they are foolish, childish, and idiotic, that all the Bible is inspired, that some of the books are not inspired, that there is to be a general judgment when the sheep and goats are to be divided, that there will never be any general judgment, that the sacramental bread and wine are changed into the flesh and blood of God and the Trinity, that they are not changed, that God has no flesh or blood, that there is a place called purgatory, that there is no such place, that unbaptized infants will be lost, that they will be saved, that we must believe the Apostles' Creed, that the Apostles made no creed, that the Holy Ghost was the Father of Christ, that Joseph was his father, that the Holy Ghost had the form of a dove, that there is no Holy Ghost, that heretics should be killed, that you must not resist evil, that you should murder unbelievers, that you must love your enemies, that you should take no thought for the morrow, but should be diligent in business, that you should lend to all who ask, and that one who does not provide for his own household is worse than an infidel. In defense of all these creeds, all these contradictions, thousands of volumes have been written, millions of sermons have been preached, countless swords reddened with blood, and thousands of nights made lurid with the faggot's flames. Hundreds and hundreds of commentators have obscured and darkened the meaning of the plainest texts, spiritualized dates, names, numbers, and even genealogies. They have degraded the poetic, changed parables to history, and imagery to stupid and impossible facts. They have wrestled with rhapsody and prophecy, with visions and dreams, with illusions and delusions, with myths and miracles, with the blunders of ignorance, the ravings of insanity, and the ecstasy of hysterics. Millions of priests and preachers have added to the mysteries of the inspired book by explanation, by showing the wisdom of foolishness, the foolishness of wisdom, the mercy of cruelty, and the probability of the impossible. The theologians made the Bible a master and the people its slaves. With this book, they destroyed intellectual veracity, the natural manliness of man. With this book, they banished pity from the heart, subverted all ideas of justice and fairness, imprisoned the soul in the dungeon of fear, and made honest doubt a crime. Think of what the world has suffered from fear. Think of the millions who were driven to insanity. Think of the fearful nights, nights filled with phantoms, with flying, crawling monsters, with hissing serpents that slowly uncoiled, with vague and formless horrors, with burning and malicious eyes. Think of the fear of death, of infinite wrath, of everlasting revenge in the prisons of fire, of an eternity of thirst, of endless regret, of the sobs and sighs, the shrieks and groans of eternal pain. Think of the hearts hardened, of the hearts broken, of the cruelties inflicted, of the agonies endured, of the lives darkened. The inspired Bible has been and is the greatest curse of Christendom, and will so remain as long as it is held to be inspired. Our God was made by men, sculptured by savages who did the best they could. They made our God somewhat like themselves, and gave to him their passions, their ideas of right and wrong. As man advanced, he slowly changed his God, took a little ferocity from his heart, and put the light of kindness in his eyes. As man progressed, he obtained a wider view, extended the intellectual horizon, and again he changed his God, making him as nearly perfect as he could. And yet this God was patterned after those who made him. As man became civilized, as he became merciful, he began to love justice, and as his mind expanded, his ideal became purer, nobler, and so his God became more merciful, more loving. In our day, Jehovah has been outgrown. He is no longer the perfect. Now theologians talk not of Jehovah, but about a God of love, call him the eternal Father and the perpetual friend and providence of man. But while they talk about this God of love, cyclones wreck and rend, the earthquake devours, the flood destroys, the red bolt leaping from the cloud still crashes the life out of men, and plague and fever still are tireless reapers in the harvest fields of death. They tell us now that all is good, that evil is but blessing in disguise, that pain makes strong and virtuous men, makes character, while pleasure enfeebles and degrades. If this be so, the souls in hell should grow to greatness, while those in heaven should shrink and shrivel. But we know that good is good. We know that good is not evil, and that evil is not good. We know that light is not darkness, and that darkness is not light. But we do not feel that good and evil were planned and caused by a supernatural God. We regard them both as necessities. We neither thank nor curse. We know that some evil can be avoided and that the good can be increased. We know that this can be done by increasing knowledge, by developing the brain. As Christians have changed their God, so they have accordingly changed their Bible. The impossible and absurd, the cruel and the infamous, have been mostly thrown aside, and thousands are now engaged in trying to save the inspired word. Of course, the orthodox still cling to every word, and still insist that every line is true. They are literalists. To them, the Bible means exactly what it says. They want no explanation. They care nothing for commentators. Contradictions cannot disturb their faith. They deny that any contradictions exist. They loyally stand by the sacred text, and they give it the narrowest possible interpretation. They are like the janitor of an apartment house who refused to rent a flat to a gentleman because he said he had children. "But," said the gentleman, "my children are both married and live in Iowa." "That makes no difference," said the janitor. "I am not allowed to rent a flat to any man who has children." All the Orthodox churches are obstructions on the highway of progress. Every Orthodox creed is a chain, a dungeon. Every believer in the inspired book is a slave who drives reason from her throne, and in her stead crowns fear. Reason is the light, the sun of the brain. It is the compass of the mind, the ever-constant northern star, the mountain peak that lifts itself above all clouds. There were centuries of darkness when religion had control of Christendom. Superstition was almost universal. Not one in 20,000 could read or write. During these centuries, the people lived with their back to the sunrise, and pursued their way toward the dens of ignorance and faith. There was no progress, no invention, no discovery. On every hand, cruelty and worship, persecution and prayer. The priests were the enemies of thought, of investigation. They were the shepherds, and the people were their sheep, and it was their business to guard the flock from the wolves of thought and doubt. This world was of no importance compared with the next. This life was to be spent in preparing for the life to come. The gold and labor of men were wasted in building cathedrals and in supporting the pious and the useless. During these dark ages of Christianity, as I said before, nothing was invented, nothing was discovered, calculated to increase the well-being of men. The energies of Christendom were wasted in the vain effort to obtain assistance from the supernatural. For centuries, the business of Christians was to wrest from the followers of Mohammed the empty sepulchre of Christ. Upon the altar of this folly, millions of lives were sacrificed, and yet the soldiers of the impostor were victorious, and the wretches who carried the banner of Christ were scattered like leaves before the storm. There was, I believe, one invention during these ages. It is said that, in the 13th century, Roger Bacon, a Franciscan monk, invented gunpowder, but this invention was without a fellow. Yet we cannot give Christianity the credit, because Bacon was an infidel, and was great enough to say that in all things reason must be the standard. He was persecuted and imprisoned, as most sensible men were in those blessed days. The church was triumphant. The scepter and mitre were in her hands, and yet her success was the result of force and fraud, and it carried within itself the seeds of its defeat. The church attempted the impossible. It endeavored to make the world of one belief, to force all minds to a common form, and utterly destroy the individuality of man. To accomplish this, it employed every art and artifice that cunning could suggest. It inflicted every cruelty by every means that malice could invent. But in spite of all, a few men began to think. They became interested in the affairs of this world, in the great panorama of nature. They began to seek for causes, for the explanations of phenomena. They were not satisfied with the assertions of the church. These thinkers withdrew their gaze from the skies and looked at their own surroundings. They were unspiritual enough to desire comfort here. They became sensible and secular, worldly and wise. What was the result? They began to invent, to discover, to find the relation between facts, the conditions of happiness, and the means that would increase the well-being of their fellow men. Movable types were invented, paper was borrowed from the Moors, books appeared, and it became possible to save the intellectual wealth so that each generation could hand it to the next. History began to take the place of legend and rumor. The telescope was invented. The orbits of the stars were traced, and men became citizens of the universe. The steam engine was constructed, and now steam, the great slave, does the work of hundreds of millions of men. The black art, the impossible, was abandoned, and chemistry, the useful, took its place. Astrology became astronomy. Kepler discovered the three great laws, one of the greatest triumphs of human genius, and our constellation became a poem, a symphony. Newton gave us the mathematical expression of the attraction of gravitation. Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood. He gave us the fact, and Draper gave us the reason. Steamships conquered the seas, and railways covered the land. Houses and streets were lighted with gas. Through the invention of matches, fire became the companion of man. The art of photography became known. The sun became an artist. Telegraphs and cables were invented. The lightning became a carrier of thought, and the nations became neighbors. Anesthetics were discovered, and pain was lost in sleep. Surgery became a science. The telephone was invented, the telephone that carries and deposits in listening ears the waves of words. The phonograph that catches and retains in marks and dots, and gives again the echoes of our speech. Then came electric light that fills the night with day, and all the wonderful machines that use the subtle force, the same force that leaps from the summer cloud to ravage and destroy. The spectrum analysis that tells us of the substance of the sun, the Röntgen rays that change the opaque to the transparent. The great thinkers demonstrated the indestructibility of force and matter, demonstrated that the indestructible could not have been created. The geologist, in rocks and deposits and mountains and continents, read a little of the story of the world, of its changes of the glacial epoch, the story of vegetable and animal life. The biologists, through the fossil forms of life, established the antiquity of man and demonstrated the worthlessness of Holy Writ. Then came evolution, the survival of the fittest, and natural selection. Thousands of mysteries were explained, and science wrested the scepter from superstition. The cell theory was advanced, and embryology was studied. The microscope discovered germs of disease, and taught us how to stay the plague. These great theories and discoveries, together with countless inventions, are the children of intellectual liberty. After all, we know but a little. In the darkness of life, there are a few gleams of light. Possibly the dropping of a dishcloth prophesies the coming of company, but we have no evidence. Possibly it is dangerous for 13 to dine together, but we have no evidence. Possibly a maiden's matrimonial chances are determined by the number of seeds in an apple or the number of leaves on a flower, but we have no evidence. Possibly certain stones give good luck to the wearer, while the wearing of others brings loss and death. Possibly a glimpse of the new moon over the left shoulder brings misfortune. Possibly there are curative virtues in old bones, in sacred rags and holy hairs, in images and bits of wood, in rusty nails and dried blood. But the trouble is, we have no evidence. Possibly comets, eclipses, and shooting stars foretell the death of kings, the destruction of nations, or the coming of plague. Possibly devils take possession of the bodies and minds of men. Possibly witches, with the devil's help, control the winds, breed storms on sea and land, fill summer's lap with frosts and snow, and work with charm and spell against the public weal. But of this we have no evidence. It may be that all the miracles described in the Old and New Testament were performed, that the pallid flesh of the dead felt once more the thrill of life, that the corpse arose and felt upon his smiling lips the kiss of wife and child. Possibly water was turned into wine, loaves and fishes increased, and possibly devils were expelled from men and women. Possibly fishes were found with money in their mouths. Possibly clay and spittle brought back the light to sightless eyes, and possibly words cured disease and made the leper clean. But of this we have no evidence. Possibly iron floated, rivers divided, waters burst from dry bones, birds carried food to prophets, and angels flourished drawn swords. But of this we have no evidence. Possibly Jehovah employed lying spirits to deceive a king, and all the wonders of the savage world may have happened. But the trouble is, there is no proof. So there may be a devil, almost infinite in cunning and power, and he may have a countless number of imps, whose only business is to sow the seeds of evil and to vex, mislead, capture, and imprison in eternal flames the souls of men. All this, so far as we know, is possible. All we know is that we have no evidence except the assertions of ignorant priests. Possibly there is a place called hell where all the devils live, a hell whose flames are waiting for all the men who think and have the courage to express their thoughts, for all who fail to credit priests and sacred books, for all who walk the path that reason lights, for all the good and brave who lack credulity and faith. But of this, I am happy to say, there is no proof. And so there may be a place called heaven, the home of God, where angels float and fly and play on harps, and hear with joy the groans and shrieks of the lost in hell. But of this there is no evidence. It all rests on dreams and visions of the insane. There may be a power superior to nature, a power that governs and directs all things. But the existence of this power has not been established. In the presence of the mysteries of life and thought, of force and substance, of growth and decay, of birth and death, of joy and pain, of the sufferings of the good, the triumphs of wrong, the intelligent, honest man is compelled to say, I do not know. but we do know how gods and devils, heavens and hells have been made. We know the history of inspired books, the origin of religions. We know how the seeds of superstition were planted and what made them grow. We know that all superstitions, all creeds, all follies and mistakes, all crimes and cruelties, all virtues, vices, hopes and fears, all discoveries and inventions have been naturally produced. By the light of reason we divide the useful from the hurtful, the false from the true. We know the past, the paths that man has traveled, his mistakes, his triumphs. We know a few facts, a few fragments, and the imagination, the artist of the mind, with these facts, these fragments, rebuilds the past, and on the canvas of the future deftly paints the things to be. We believe in the natural, in the unbroken and unbreakable succession of causes and effects. We deny the existence of the supernatural. We do not believe in any God who can be pleased with incense, with kneeling, with bell ringing, psalm singing, bead counting, fasting, or prayer, in any God who can be flattered by words of faith or fear. We believe in the natural. We have no fear of devils, ghosts, or hells. We believe that Mahatmas, astral bodies, materializations of spirits, crystal gazing, seeing the future, telepathy, mind reading, and Christian Science are only cunning frauds, the genuineness of which is established by the testimony of incompetent, honest witnesses. We believe that cunning plates fraud with the gold of honesty, and veneers vice with virtue. We know that millions are seeking the impossible, trying to secure the aid of the supernatural to solve the problem of life, to guess the riddle of destiny, and to pluck from the future its secret. We know that all their efforts are in vain. We believe in the natural. We believe in home and fireside, in wife and child and friend, in the realities of this world. We have faith in facts, in knowledge, in the development of the brain. We throw away superstition and welcome science. We banish phantoms, the mistakes and lies, and cling to the truth. We do not enthrone the unknown and crown our ignorance. We do not stand with our backs to the sun and mistake our shadow for God. We do not create a master and thankfully wear his chains. We do not enslave ourselves. We want no leaders, no followers. Our desire is that every human being shall be true to himself, to his ideal, unbribed by promises, careless of threats. We want no tyrant on the earth or in the air. We know that superstition has given us delusions and illusions, dreams and visions, ceremonies and cruelties, faith and fanaticism, beggars and bigots, persecutions and prayers, theology and torture, piety and poverty, saints and slaves, miracles and mummeries, disease and death. We know that science has given us all we have of value. Science is the only civilizer. It has freed the slave, clothed the naked, fed the hungry, lengthened life, given us homes and hearths, pictures and books, ships and railways, telegraphs and cables, engines that tirelessly turn the countless wheels, and it has destroyed the monsters, the phantoms, the winged horrors that filled the savage brain. Science is the real Redeemer. It will put honesty above hypocrisy, mental veracity above all belief. It will teach the religion of usefulness. It will destroy bigotry in all its forms. It will put thoughtful doubt above thoughtless faith. It will give us philosophers, thinkers, and savants, instead of priests, theologians, and saints. It will abolish poverty and crime, and greater, grander, nobler than all else, it will make the whole world free. End of Superstition by Robert G. Ingersoll. Recorded for LibriVox by Joe Dickerson, December 2013.
Section 12 of The Works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, Lectures, Dresden edition, published 1900. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nigel Carrington. The Works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, The Devil, Part 1. If the devil should die, would God make another? A little while ago I delivered a lecture on superstition, in which, among other things, I said that the Christian world could not deny the existence of the devil, that the devil was really the keystone of the arch, and that to take him away was to destroy the entire system. A great many clergymen answered or criticized this statement. Some of these ministers avowed their belief in the existence of his satanic majesty, while others actually denied his existence. But some, without stating their own position, said that others believed not in the existence of a personal devil, but in the personification of evil, and that all references to the devil in the Scriptures could be explained on the hypothesis that the devil thus alluded to was simply a personification of evil. When I read these answers, I thought on this line from Heine: Christ rode on an ass, but now asses ride on Christ. Now, the questions are, first, whether the devil does really exist. Second, whether the sacred scriptures teach the existence of the devil and of unclean spirits. And third, whether this belief in devils is a necessary part of what is known as Orthodox Christianity. Now, where did the idea that a devil exists come from? How was it produced? Fear is an artist, a sculptor, a painter. All tribes and nations having suffered, having been the sport and prey of natural phenomena, having been struck by lightning, poisoned by weeds, overwhelmed by volcanoes, destroyed by earthquakes, believed in the existence of a devil, who was the king, the ruler of innumerable smaller devils. And all these devils have been from time immemorial regarded as the enemies of men. Along the banks of the Ganges wandered the Asuras, the most powerful of evil spirits. Their business was to war against the Devas, that is to say, the gods, and at the same time against human beings. There, too, were the ogres, the jakshas, and many others who killed and devoured human beings. The Persians turned this around, and with them the Asuras were good, and the Devas bad. Ormuzd was the good, the god, Ahriman the evil, the devil. And between the god and the devil was waged a perpetual war. Some of the Persians thought that the evil would finally triumph, but others insisted that the good would be the victor. In Egypt, the devil was Set, or, as usually called, Typhon, and the good god was Osiris. Set and his legions fought against Osiris and against the human race. Among the Greeks, the Titans were the enemies of the gods. Arte was the spirit that tempted, and such was her power that at one time she tempted and misled the god of gods, even Zeus himself. These ideas about gods and devils often changed, because in the days of Socrates, a demon was not a devil, but a guardian angel. We obtain our devil from the Jews, and they got him from Babylon. The Jews cultivated the science of demonology, and at one time it was believed that there were 9 kinds of demons: Beelzebub, prince of the false gods of the other nations; the Pythian Apollo, prince of liars; Belial, prince of mischief makers; Asmodeus, prince of revengeful devils; Satan, prince of witches and magicians; Meresin, prince of aerial devils, who caused thunderstorms and plagues; Abaddon, who caused wars, tumults, and combustions; Diabolus, who drives to despair; and Mammon, prince of the tempters. It was believed that demons and sorcerers frequently came together and held what were called sabbats, that is to say, orgies. It was also known that sorcerers and witches had marks on their bodies that had been imprinted by the devil. Of course, these devils were all made by the people. And in these devils we find the prejudices of their makers. The Europeans always represent their devils as black, while the Africans believed that theirs were white. So it was believed that people, by the aid of the devil, could assume any shape that they wished. Witches and wizards were changed into wolves, dogs, cats, and serpents. This change to animal form was exceedingly common. Within 2 years, between 1598 and 1600, in one district of France, the district of Jura, more than 600 men and women were tried and convicted before one judge of having changed themselves into wolves, and all were put to death. This is only one instance. There are thousands. There is no time to give the history of this belief in devils. It has been universal. The consequences have been terrible beyond the imagination. Millions and millions of men, women, and children, of fathers and mothers, have been sacrificed upon the altar of this ignorant and idiotic belief. Of course, the Christians of today do not believe that the devils of the Hindus, Egyptians, Persians, or Babylonians existed. They think that those nations created their own devils, precisely the same as they did their own gods. But the Christians of today admit that for many centuries Christians did believe in the existence of countless devils, that the fathers of the Church believed as sincerely in the devil and his demons as in God and his angels, that they were just as sure about hell as heaven. I admit that people did the best they could to account for what they saw, for what they experienced. I admit that the devils as well as the gods were naturally produced. The effect of nature upon the human brain, the cause of phenomena, filled our ancestors not only with wonder but with terror. The miraculous, the supernatural, was not only believed in but was always expected. A man walking in the woods at night, just a glimmering of the moon, everything uncertain and shadowy, sees a monstrous form. One arm is raised. His blood grows cold. His hair lifts. In the gloom he sees the eyes of an ogre, eyes that flame with malice. He feels that the something is approaching. He turns and with a cry of horror takes to his heels. He is afraid to look back. Spent, out of breath, shaking with fear, he reaches his hut and falls at the door. When he regains consciousness, he tells his story, and, of course, the children believe. When they become men and women, they tell Father's story of having seen the devil to their children. And so the children and grandchildren not only believe, but think they know that their father, their grandfather, actually saw a devil. An old woman sitting by the fire at night, a storm raging without, hears the mournful sough of the wind. To her it becomes a voice. Her imagination is touched, and the voice seems to utter words. Out of these words she constructs a message or a warning from the unseen world. If the words are good, she has heard an angel. If they are threatening and malicious, she has heard a devil. She tells this to her children, and they believe. They say that mother's religion is good enough for them. A girl suffering from hysteria falls into a trance, has visions of the infernal world. The priest sprinkles holy water on her pallid face, saying, "She hath a devil." A man utters a terrible cry, falls to the ground. Foam and blood issue from his mouth. His limbs are convulsed. The spectators say, "This is the devil's work." Through all the ages, people have mistaken dreams and visions of fear for realities. To them, the insane were inspired. Epileptics were possessed by devils. Apoplexy was the work of an unclean spirit. For many centuries, people believed that they had actually seen the malicious phantoms of the night. And so thorough was this belief, so vivid, that they made pictures of them. They knew how they looked. They drew and chiseled their hoofs, their horns, all their malicious deformities. Now, I admit that all these monsters were naturally produced. The people believed that hell was their native land, that the devil was the king, and that he and his imps waged war against the children of men. Curiously enough, some of these devils were made out of degraded gods, and naturally enough, many devils were made out of the gods of other nations, so that frequently the gods of one people were the devils of another. In nature there are opposing forces. Some of the forces work for what man calls good, some for what he calls evil. Back of these forces our ancestors put will, intelligence, and design. They could not believe that the good and evil came from the same being, so back of the good they put God, back of the evil, the devil. The atlas of Christianity is the devil. The religion known as Christianity was invented by God himself to repair in part the wreck and ruin that had resulted from the devil's work. Take the devil from the scheme of salvation, from the atonement, from the dogma of eternal pain, and the foundation is gone. The devil is the keystone of the arch. He inflicted the wounds that Christ came to heal. He corrupted the human race. The question now is, does the Old Testament teach the existence of the devil? If the Old Testament teaches anything, it does teach the existence of the devil, of Satan, of the serpent, of the enemy of God and man, the deceiver of men and women. Those who believe the Scriptures are compelled to say that this devil was created by God, and that God knew when he created him just what he would do, the exact measure of his success, knew that he would be a successful rival, knew that he would deceive and corrupt the children of men, knew that by reason of this devil, countless millions of human beings would suffer eternal torment in the prison of pain. And this God also knew when he created the devil that he, God, would be compelled to leave his throne, to be born a babe in Palestine, and to suffer a cruel death. All this he knew when he created the devil. Why did he create him? It is no answer to say that this devil was once an angel of light and fell from his high estate because he was free. God knew what he would do with his freedom when he made him and gave him liberty of action, and, as a matter of fact, must have made him with the intention that he should rebel, that he should fall, that he should become a devil, that he should tempt and corrupt the father and mother of the human race, that he should make hell a necessity, and that, in consequence of his creation, countless millions of the children of men would suffer eternal pain. Why did he create him? Admit that God is infinitely wise. Has he ingenuity enough to frame an excuse for the creation of the devil? Does the Old Testament teach the existence of a real, living devil? The first account of this being is found in Genesis, and in that account he is called the serpent. He is declared to have been more subtle than any beast of the field. According to the account, this serpent had a conversation with Eve, the first woman. We are not told in what language they conversed, or how they understood each other, as this was the first time they had met. Where did Eve get her language? Where did the serpent get his? Of course, such questions are impudent, but at the same time, they are natural. The result of this conversation was that Eve ate the forbidden fruit and induced Adam to do the same. This is what is called the fall, and for this they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. On account of this, God cursed the earth with weeds and thorns and brambles, cursed man with toil, made woman a slave, and cursed maternity with pain and sorrow. How men, good men, can worship this God, how women, good women, can love this Jehovah, is beyond my imagination. In addition to the other curses, the serpent was cursed, condemned to crawl on his belly and to eat dust. We do not know by what means before that time he moved from place to place, whether he walked or flew. Neither do we know on what food he lived. All we know is that after that time he crawled and lived on dust. Jehovah told him that this he should do all the days of his life. It would seem from this that the serpent was not at that time immortal, that there was somewhere in the future a milepost at which the life of this serpent stopped. Whether he is living yet or not, I am not certain. It will not do to say that this is allegory or a poem, because this proves too much. If the serpent did not in fact exist, how do we know that Adam and Eve existed? Is all that is said about God allegory and poetic or mythical? Is the whole account, after all, an ignorant dream? Neither will it do to say that the devil, the serpent, was a personification of evil. Do personifications of evil talk? Can a personification of evil crawl on its belly? Can a personification of evil eat dust? If we say that the devil was a personification of evil, are we not at the same time compelled to say that Jehovah was a personification of good, that the Garden of Eden was the personification of a place, and that the whole story is a personification of something that did not happen? Maybe that Adam and Eve were not driven out of the garden. They may have suffered only the personification of exile. And maybe the cherubim, placed at the gate of Eden with flaming swords, were only personifications of policemen. There is no escape. If the Old Testament is true, the devil does exist, and it is impossible to explain him away without at the same time explaining God away. So there are many references to devils and spirits of divination and of evil, which I have not the time to call attention to, but in the book of Job, Satan, the devil, has a conversation with God. It is this devil that brings the sorrows and losses on the upright man. It is this devil that raises the storm that wrecks the homes of Job's children. It is this devil that kills the children of Job. Take this devil from that book, and all meaning, plot, and purpose fade away. Is it possible to say that the devil in Job was only a personification of evil? In Chronicles we are told that Satan provoked David to number Israel. For this act of David, caused by the devil, God did not smite the devil, did not punish David, but he killed 70,000 poor innocent Jews who had done nothing but stand up and be counted. Was this devil who tempted David a personification of evil? Or was Jehovah a personification of the devilish? In Zechariah we are told that Joshua stood before the angel of the Lord, and that Satan stood at his right hand to resist him, and that the Lord rebuked Satan. If words convey any meaning, the Old Testament teaches the existence of the devil. All the passages about witches and those having familiar spirits were born of a belief in the devil. When a man who loved Jehovah wanted revenge on his enemy, he fell on his holy knees, and from a heart full of religion he cried, "Let Satan stand at his right hand." Take the devil from the drama of Christianity, and the plot is gone. The next question is, does the New Testament teach the existence of the devil? As a matter of fact, the New Testament is far more explicit than the Old. The Jews, believing that Jehovah was God, had very little business for a devil. Jehovah was wicked enough and malicious enough to take the devil's place. The first reference in the New Testament to the devil is in the 4th chapter of Matthew. We are told that Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. It seems that he was not led by the devil into the wilderness, but by the Spirit, that the Spirit and the devil were acting together in a kind of pious conspiracy. In the wilderness, Jesus fasted 40 days, and then the devil asked him to turn stones into bread. The devil also took him to Jerusalem and set him on a pinnacle of the temple and tried to induce him to leap to the earth. The devil also took him to the top of a mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and offered them all to him in exchange for his worship. Jesus refused. The devil went away, and angels came and ministered to Christ. Now, the question is, did the author of this account believe in the existence of the devil, or did he regard this devil as a personification of evil? And did he intend that his account should be understood as an allegory, or as a poem, or as a myth? Was Jesus tempted? If he was tempted, who tempted him? Did anybody offer him the kingdoms of the world? Did the writer of the account try to convey to the reader the thought that Christ was tempted by the devil? If Christ was not tempted by the devil, then the temptation was born in his own heart. If that be true, can it be said that he was divine? If these adders, these vipers, were coiled in his bosom, was he the Son of God? Was he pure? In the same chapter we are told that Christ healed those which were possessed of devils, and those which were lunatic, and those that had the palsy. From this it is evident that a distinction was made between those possessed with devils and those whose minds were affected and those who were afflicted with diseases. In the 8th chapter we are told that people brought unto Christ many that were possessed with devils, and that he cast out the spirits with his word. Now, can we say that these people were possessed with personifications of evil, and that these personifications of evil were cast out? Are these personifications entities? Have they form and shape? Do they occupy space? Then comes the story of the 2 men possessed with devils who came from the tombs and were exceeding fierce. It is said that when they saw Jesus, they cried out, "What have we to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of God? Art thou come hither to torment us before the time?" If these were simply personifications of evil, how did they know that Jesus was the Son of God, and how can a personification of evil be tormented? We are told that at the same time, a good way off, many swine were feeding, and that the devils besought Christ, saying, "If thou cast us out, suffer us to go away into the herd of swine." And he said unto them, "Go." Is it possible that personifications of evil would desire to enter the bodies of swine? And is it possible that it was necessary for them to have the consent of Christ before they could enter the swine? The question naturally arises, how did they enter into the body of the man? Did they do that without Christ's consent? And is it a fact that Christ protects swine and neglects human beings? Can personifications have desires? In the 9th chapter of Matthew, there was a dumb man brought to Jesus, possessed with a devil. Jesus cast out the devil, and the dumb man spake. Did a personification of evil prevent the dumb man from talking? Did it in some way paralyze his organs of speech? Could it have done this, had it only been a personification of evil? In the 10th chapter, Jesus gives his 12 disciples power to cast out unclean spirits. What were unclean spirits supposed to be? Did they really exist? Were they shadows, impersonations, allegories? When Jesus sent his disciples forth on the great mission to convert the world, among other things, he told them to heal the sick, to raise the dead, and to cast out devils. Here, a distinction is made between the sick and those who were possessed by evil spirits. Now, what did Christ mean by devils? In the 12th chapter, we're told of a very remarkable case. There was brought unto Jesus one possessed with a devil, blind and dumb, and Jesus healed him. The blind and dumb both spake and saw. Thereupon the Pharisees said, This fellow doth not cast out devils, but by Beelzebub, the prince of devils. Jesus answered by saying, Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation. If Satan cast out Satan, he is divided against himself. Why did not Christ tell the Pharisees that he did not cast out devils, only personifications of evil, and that with these personifications Beelzebub had nothing to do? Another question, did the Pharisees believe in the existence of devils, or had they the personification idea? At the same time, Christ said, If I cast out devils by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God is come unto you. If he meant anything by these words, he certainly intended to convey the idea that what he did demonstrated the superiority of God over the devil. Did Christ believe in the existence of the devil? In the 15th chapter is the account of the woman of Canaan, who cried unto Jesus, saying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, thou son of David. My daughter is sorely vexed with the devil. On account of her faith, Christ made the daughter whole. In the 16th chapter, a man brought his son to Jesus. The boy was a lunatic, sore, vexed, oftentimes falling in the fire and water. The disciples had tried to cure him and had failed. Jesus rebuked the devil, and the devil departed out of him, and the boy was cured. Was the devil in this case a personification of evil? The disciples then asked Jesus why they could not cast that devil out. Jesus told them that it was because of their unbelief, and then added, Howbeit this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting. From this it would seem that some personifications were easier to expel than others. The first chapter of Mark throws a little light on the story of the temptation of Christ. Matthew tells us that Jesus was led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. In Mark we're told who this Spirit was. And straightway, coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens opened, and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And there came a voice from heaven, saying, Thou art my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And immediately the Spirit driveth him into the wilderness. Why the Holy Ghost should hand Christ over to the tender mercies of the devil is not explained. And it is all the more wonderful when we remember that the Holy Ghost was the third person in the Trinity and Christ the second, and that this Holy Ghost was in fact God, and that Christ also was in fact God, so that God led God into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. we are told that Christ was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted of Satan, and was with the wild beasts, and that the angels ministered unto him. Were these angels real angels, or were they personifications of good, of comfort? So we see that the same Spirit that came out of heaven, the same Spirit that said, "This is my beloved Son," drove Christ into the wilderness to be tempted of Satan. Was this devil a real being? Was this spirit who claimed to be the Father of Christ a real being? Or was he a personification? Are the heavens a real place? Are they a personification? Did the wild beasts live? And did the angels minister unto Christ? In other words, is the story true, or is it poetry, or metaphor, or mistake, or falsehood? It might be asked, why did God wish to be tempted by the devil? Was God ambitious to obtain a victory over Satan? Was Satan foolish enough to think that he could mislead God? And is it possible that the devil offered to give the world as a bribe to its creator and owner, knowing at the same time that Christ was the creator and owner, and also knowing that he, Christ, knew that he, the devil, knew that he, Christ, was the creator and owner? Is not the whole story absurdly idiotic? The devil knew that Christ was God, and knew that Christ knew that the tempter was the devil. It may be asked how I know that the devil knew that Christ was God. My answer is found in the same chapter. There is an account of what a devil said to Christ. "Let us alone. What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Art thou come to destroy us? I know thee, thou art the Holy One of God." Certainly, if the little devils knew this, the devil himself must have had like information. Jesus rebuked this devil and said to him, "Hold thy peace and come out of him." And when the unclean spirit had torn him and cried with a loud voice, he came out of him. So we are told that Jesus cast out many devils, and suffered not the devils to speak, because they knew him. So it is said in the 3rd chapter that unclean spirits, when they saw him, fell down before him and cried, saying, "Thou art the Son of God." In the 5th chapter is an account of casting out the devils that went into the swine, and we are told that all the devils besought him, saying, "Send us into the swine." And Jesus gave them leave. Again, I ask, was it necessary for the devils to get the permission of Christ before they could enter swine? Again, I ask, by whose permission did they enter into the man? Could personifications of evil enter a herd of swine, or could personifications of evil make a bargain with Christ? In the 6th chapter we are told that the disciples cast out many devils and anointed with oil many that were sick. Here again the distinction is made between those possessed by devils and those afflicted by disease. It will not do to say that the devils were diseases or personifications. In the 7th chapter, a Greek woman whose daughter was possessed of a devil besought Christ to cast this devil out. At last Christ said, "The devil is gone out of thy daughter." In the 9th chapter, one of the multitude said unto Christ, "I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. I spoke unto thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not." So they brought this boy before Christ, and when the boy saw him, the spirit tare him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. Christ asked the father, "How long is it ago since this came unto him?" And he answered, "Of a child, and ofttimes it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him." Then Christ said, "Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him." And the spirit cried and rent him sore, and came out of him, and he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, "He is dead." Then the disciples asked Jesus why they could not cast them out, and Jesus said, "This kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting." Is there any doubt about the belief of the man who wrote this account? Is there any allegory or poetry or myth in this story? The devil in this case was not an ordinary everyday devil. He was dumb and deaf. It was no use to order him out because he could not hear. The only way was to pray and fast. Is there such a thing as a dumb and deaf devil? If so, the devils must be organized. They must have ears and organs of speech, and they must be dumb because there's something the matter with the apparatus of speaking, and they must be deaf because something is the matter with their ears. It would seem from this that they are not simply spiritual beings, but organized on a physical basis. Now, we know that the ears do not hear. It is the brain that hears. So these devils must have brains. That is to say, they must have been what we call organized beings. Now, it is hardly possible that personifications of evil are dumb or deaf. That is to say, that they have physical imperfections. In the same chapter, John tells Christ that he saw one casting out devils in Christ's name who did not follow with them, and Jesus said, "Forbid him not." By this he seemed to admit that someone, not a follower of his, was casting out devils in his name, and he was willing that he should go on because, as he said, "For there's no man which shall do a miracle in my name that can lightly speak evil of me." In the 4th chapter of Luke, the story of the temptation of Christ by the devil is again told with a few additions. All the writers, having been inspired, did not remember exactly the same things. Luke tells us that the devil said unto Christ, having shown him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, "All this power will I give thee, and the glory of them, for that is delivered unto me, and to whomsoever I will I give it. If thou wilt worship me, all shall be thine." We're also told that when the devil had ended all the temptation, he departed from him for a season. The date of his return is not given. In the same chapter we are told that a man in the synagogue had a spirit of an unclean devil. This devil recognized Jesus and admitted that he was the Holy One of God. As a matter of fact, the apostles seem to have relied upon the evidence of devils to substantiate the divinity of their Lord. Jesus said to this devil, "Hold thy peace and come out of him." And the devil, after throwing the man down, came out. In the 41st verse of the same chapter it is said, "And devils also came out of many, crying out and saying, Thou art Christ, the Son of God." It is also said that Christ rebuked them and suffered them not to speak, for they knew that he was Christ. Now, it will not do to say that these devils were diseases, because diseases could not talk, and diseases would not recognize Christ as the Son of God. After all, epilepsy is not a theologian. I admit that lunacy comes nearer. In the 8th chapter is told again the story of the devils and the swine. In this account, Jesus asked the devil his name, and the devil replied, "Legion." In the 9th chapter is told the story of the devil that the disciples could not cast out, but was cast out by Christ, and in the 13th chapter it is said that the Pharisees came to Jesus, telling him to go away, because Herod would kill him, and Jesus said unto these Pharisees, "Go ye and tell that fox, Behold, I cast out devils." What did he mean by this? Did he mean that he cured diseases? No, because in the same sentence he says, "And I do cures today," making a distinction between devils and diseases. In the 22nd chapter, an account of the betrayal of Christ by Judas is given in these words. "Then entered Satan into Judas Iscariot, being of the number of the 12. And he went his way and communed with the chief priests and captains, how they might betray him unto them. And they were glad, and covenanted to give him money." According to Christ, the little devils knew that he was the Son of God. Certainly then Satan, king of all the fiends, knew that Christ was divine. And he not only knew that, but he knew all about the scheme of salvation. He knew that Christ wished to make an atonement of blood by the sacrifice of himself. According to Christian theologians, the devil has always done his utmost to gain possession of the souls of men. At the time he entered into Judas, persuading him to betray Christ, he knew that if Christ was betrayed, he would be crucified, and that he would make an atonement for all believers, and that, as a result, he, the devil, would lose all the souls that Christ gained. What interest had the devil in defeating himself? If he could have prevented the betrayal, then Christ would not have been crucified, no atonement would have been made, and the whole world would have gone to hell. The success of the devil would have been complete. But according to this story, the devil outwitted himself. How thankful we should be to his satanic majesty. He opened for us the gates of paradise and made it possible for us to obtain eternal life. Without Satan, without Judas, not a single human being could have become an angel of light. All would have been wingless devils in the prison of flame. In Jerusalem, to the extent of his power, Satan repaired the wreck and ruin he had wrought in the Garden of Eden. Certainly the writers of the New Testament believed in the existence of the devil. In the 8th chapter it is said that out of Mary Magdalene were cast 7 devils. To me, Mary Magdalene is the most beautiful character in the New Testament. She is the one true disciple. In the darkness of the crucifixion, she lingered near. She was the first at the sepulchre. Defeat, disaster, disgrace could not conquer her love, and yet according to the account, when she met the risen Christ, he said, "Touch me not." This was the reward of her infinite devotion. In the Gospel of John, we are told that John the Baptist said that he saw the Spirit descending from heaven like a dove, and that it abode upon Christ. But in the Gospel of John, nothing is said about the Spirit driving Christ into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Possibly John never heard of that, or forgot it, or did not believe it. But in the 13th chapter, I find this. And supper being ended, the devil, having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. In John, there are no accounts of the casting out of devils by Christ or his apostles. On that subject there is no word. Possibly John had his doubts. In the 5th chapter of Acts, we are told that the people brought the sick and those which were vexed with unclean spirits to the apostles, and the apostles healed them. Here again, there is made a clear distinction between the sick and those possessed by devils. And in the 8th chapter, we are told that unclean spirits, crying with a loud voice, came out of them. In the 13th chapter, Paul calls Elymas the child of the devil. And in the 16th chapter an account is given of a damsel possessed with a spirit of divination, who brought her masters much gain by soothsaying. Paul and Silas, it would seem, cast out this spirit, and by reason of that suffered great persecution. In the 19th chapter certain vagabond Jews pronounced over those who had evil spirits the name of Jesus, and the evil spirits answered, "Jesus I know, and Paul I know, but who are ye?" And the man in whom the evil spirit was leaped on them, so that they fled naked and wounded. Paul, writing to the Corinthians in the 8th chapter, says, "I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. Ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Ye cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the table of devils. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy?" In the 11th chapter, he says that long hair is the glory of woman, but that she ought to keep her head covered because of the angels. In those intellectual days, people believed in what were called the incubi and the succubi. The incubi were male angels, and the succubi were female angels, and according to the belief of that time, nothing so attracted the incubi as the beautiful hair of women, and for this reason Paul said that women should keep their heads covered. Paul calls the devil the prince of the power of the air. So in Jude, we are told that Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, durst not bring against him a railing accusation, but said, "The Lord rebuke thee." Was this devil with whom Michael contended a personification of evil, or a poem, or a myth? In 1 Peter we are told to be sober, vigilant, because your adversary the devil as a roaring lion walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Are people devoured by personifications or myths? Has an allegory an appetite, or is a poem a cannibal? So in Ephesians we are warned not to give place to the devil, and in the same book we are told, "Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." And in Hebrews it is said that him that had the power of death, that is, the devil, showing that the devil has the power of death. And in James it is said that if we resist the devil, he will flee from us. And in 1 John we are told that he that committeth sin is of the devil, for the reason that the devil sinneth from the beginning. And we are also told that for this purpose was the Son of God manifested, that he may destroy the works of the devil. No devil, no Christ. In Revelation, the insanest of all books, I find the following. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil, and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. From this it would appear that the devil once lived in heaven, raised a rebellion, was defeated and cast out, and the inspired writer congratulates the angels that they are rid of him, and commiserates us that we have him. In the 20th chapter of Revelation is the following. And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled, and after he must be loosed a little season. It is hard to understand how one could be confined in a pit without a bottom, and how a chain of iron could hold one in eternal fire, or what use there would be to lock a bottomless pit. But these are questions probably suggested by the devil. We are further told that when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison. And the devil was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever. In the light of the passages that I have read, we can clearly see what the writers of the New Testament believed. About this there can be no honest difference. If the Gospels teach the existence of God, of Christ, they teach the existence of the devil. If the devil does not exist, if little devils do not enter the bodies of men, the New Testament may be inspired, but it is not true. The early Christians proved that Christ was divine because he cast out devils. The evidence they offered was more absurd than the statement they sought to prove. They were like the old man who said that he saw a grindstone floating down the river. Someone said that a grindstone would not float. "Ah," said the old man, "but the one I saw had an iron crank in it." Of course, I do not blame the authors of the Gospels. They lived in a superstitious age, at a time when rumor was the historian, when gossip corrected the proof, and when everything was believed except the facts. The apostles, like their fellows, believed in miracles and magic. Credulity was regarded as a virtue. The Reverend Mr. Parkhurst denounces the apostles as worthless cravens. Certainly I do not agree with him. I think that they were good men. I do not believe that any one of them ever tried to reform Jerusalem on the Parkhurst plan. I admit that they honestly believed in devils, that they were credulous and superstitious. There is one story in the New Testament that illustrates my meaning. In the 5th chapter of John is the following. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool, and troubled the water. Whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in, was made whole, of whatsoever disease he had. And a certain man was there, which had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him, and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, he saith unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Jesus saith unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed, and walked. Does any sensible human being now believe this story? Was the water of Bethesda troubled by an angel? Where did the angel come from? Where do angels live? Did the angel put medicine in the water, just enough to cure one? Did he put in different medicines for different diseases, or did he have a medicine, like those that are patented now, that cured all diseases just the same? Was the water troubled by an angel? Possibly. What apostles and theologians call an angel, a scientist knows as carbonic acid gas. John does not say that the people thought the water was troubled by an angel, but he states it as a fact, and he tells us also as a fact that the first invalid that got in the water after it had been troubled was cured of what disease he had. What is the evidence of John worth? Again, I say that if the devil does not exist, the Gospels are not inspired. If devils do not exist, Christ was either honestly mistaken, insane, or an impostor. If devils do not exist, the fall of man is a mistake, and the atonement an absurdity. If devils do not exist, hell becomes only a dream of revenge. Beneath the structure called Christianity are 4 cornerstones: the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and Devil. End of Part 1. Section 13 of The Works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, Lectures, Dresden edition, published 1900. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nigel Carrington. The Works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, The Devil, Part 2. The Evidence of the Church. The devil was forced to father the failures of God. All the fathers of the Church believed in devils. All the saints won their crowns by overcoming devils. All the popes and cardinals, bishops and priests believed in devils. Most of their time was occupied in fighting devils. The whole Catholic world, from the lowest layman to the highest priest, believed in devils. They proved the existence of devils by the New Testament. They knew that these devils were citizens of hell. They knew that Satan was their king. They knew that hell was made for the devil and his angels. The founders of all the Protestant churches, the makers of all the Orthodox creeds, all the leading Protestant theologians, from Luther to the president of Princeton College, were and are firm believers in the devil. All the great commentators believed in the devil as firmly as they did in God. Under the scheme of salvation, the devil was a necessity. Somebody had to be responsible for the thorns and thistles, for the cruelties and crimes. Somebody had to father the mistakes of God. The devil was the scapegoat of Jehovah. For hundreds of years, good, honest, zealous Christians contended against the devil. They fought him day and night, and the thought that they had beaten him gave to their dying lips the smile of victory. For centuries the Church taught that the natural man was totally depraved, that he was by nature a child of the devil, and that newborn babes were tenanted by unclean spirits. As late as the middle of the 16th century, every infant that was baptized was, by that ceremony, freed from a devil. When the holy water was applied, the priest said, I command thee, thou unclean spirit, in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, that thou come out and depart from this infant, whom our Lord Jesus Christ has vouchsafed to call to his holy baptism, to be made a member of his body and of his holy congregation. At that time the fathers, the theologians, the commentators agreed that unbaptized children, including those that were born dead, went to hell. And these same fathers, theologians and commentators, said, God is love. These babes were pure as Pitys tears, innocent as their mother's loving smiles, and yet the makers of our creeds believed and taught that leering, unclean fiends inhabited their dimpled flesh. Oh, the unsearchable riches of Christianity! For many centuries the Church filled the world with devils, with malicious spirits that caused storm and tempest, disease, accident, and death, that filled the night with visions of despair, with prophecies that drove the dreamers mad. These devils assumed 1,000 forms, countless disguises, in their efforts to capture souls and destroy the Church. They deceived sometimes the wisest and the best, made priests forget their vows. They melted virtue's snow in passion's fire, and in cunning ways entrapped and smirched the innocent and good. These devils gave witches and wizards their supernatural powers and told them the secrets of the future. Millions of men and women were destroyed because they had sold themselves to the devil. At that time, Christians really believed the New Testament. They knew it was the inspired Word of God, and so believing, so knowing, as they thought, they became insane. No man has genius enough to describe the agonies that have been inflicted on innocent men and women because of this absurd belief. How it darkened the mind, hardened the heart, and poisoned life. It made the universe a madhouse presided over by an insane God. Think! Why would a merciful God allow his children to be the victims of devils? Why would a decent God allow his worshippers to believe in devils, and by reason of that belief to persecute, torture, and burn their fellow men? Christians did not ask these questions. They believed the Bible. They had confidence in the words of Christ. Personifications of evil. The orthodox ostrich thrusts his head into the sand. Many of the clergy are now ashamed to say that they believe in devils. The belief has become ignorant and vulgar. They are ashamed of the lake of fire and brimstone. It is too savage. At the same time, they do not wish to give up the inspiration of the Bible. They give new meanings to the inspired words. Now they say that devils were only personifications of evil. If the devils were only personifications of evil, what were the angels? Was the angel who told Joseph who the father of Christ was a personification? Was the Holy Ghost only the personification of a father? Was the angel who told Joseph that Herod was dead a personification of news? Were the angels who rolled away the stone and sat clothed in shining garments in the empty sepulchre of Christ a couple of personifications? Were all the angels described in the Old Testament imaginary shadows, bodiless personifications? If the angels of the Bible are real angels, the devils are real devils. Let us be honest with ourselves and each other and give to the Bible its natural, obvious meaning. Let us admit that the writers believed what they wrote. If we believe that they were mistaken, let us have the honesty and courage to say so. Certainly we have no right to change or avoid their meaning, or to dishonestly correct their mistakes. Timid preachers sully their own souls when they change what the writers of the Bible believe to be facts to allegories, parables, poems, and myths. It is impossible for any man who believes in the inspiration of the Bible to explain away the devil. If the Bible is true, the devil exists. There is no escape from this. If the devil does not exist, the Bible is not true. There is no escape from this. I admit that the devil of the Bible is an impossible contradiction, an impossible being. This devil is the enemy of God, and God is his. Now why should this devil, in another world, torment sinners who are his friends to please God, his enemy? If the devil is a personification, so is hell and the lake of fire and brimstone. All these horrors fade into allegories, into ignorant lies. Any clergyman who can read the Bible and then say that devils are personifications of evil is himself a personification of stupidity or hypocrisy. Does any intelligent man now, whose brain has not been deformed by superstition, believe in the existence of the devil? What evidence have we that he exists? Where does this devil live? What does he do for a livelihood? What does he eat? If he does not eat, he cannot think. He cannot think without the expenditure of force. He cannot create force. He must borrow it. That is to say, he must eat. How does he move from place to place? Does he walk, or does he fly, or has he invented some machine? What object has he in life? What idea of success? This devil, according to the Bible, knows that he is to be defeated, knows that the end is absolute and eternal failure, knows that every step he takes leads to the infinite catastrophe. Why does he act as he does? Our fathers thought that everything in this world came from some other realm, that all ideas of right and wrong came from above, that conscience dropped from the clouds, that the darkness was filled with imps from perdition, and the day with angels from heaven, that souls had been breathed into man by Jehovah. What there is in this world that lives and breathes was produced here. Life was not imported. Mind is not an exotic. On this planet, man is a native. This world is his mother. The Maker did not descend from the heavens. The Maker was and is here. Matter and force in their countless forms, affinities and repulsions, produced the living, breathing world. How can we account for devils? Is it possible that they creep into the bodies of men and swine? Do they stay in the stomach, or brain, in the heart, or liver? Are these devils immortal, or do they multiply and die? Were they all created at the same time, or did they spring from a single pair? If they're subject to death, what becomes of them after death? Do they go to some other world? Are they annihilated, or can they get to heaven by believing on Christ? In the brain of science, the devils have never lived. There you will find no goblins, ghosts, wraiths, or imps, no witches, spooks, or sorcerers. There the supernatural does not exist. No man of sense in the whole world believes in devils any more than he does in mermaids, vampires, gorgons, hydras, naiads, dryads, nymphs, fairies, or the anthropophagi, any more than he does in the fountain of youth, the philosopher's stone, perpetual motion, or fiat money. There is the same difference between religion and science that there is between a madhouse and a university, between a fortune-teller and a mathematician, between emotion and philosophy, between guess and demonstration. The devils have gone, and with them they have taken the miracles of Christ. They have carried away our Lord. They have taken away the inspiration of the Bible, and we are left in the darkness of nature without the consolation of hell. But let me ask the clergy a few questions. How did your devil, who was at one time an angel of light, come to sin? There was no other devil to tempt him. He was in perfectly good society, in the company of God, of the Trinity. All of his associates were perfect. How did he fall? He knew that God was infinite, and yet he waged war against him and induced about a third of the angels to volunteer. He knew that he could not succeed, knew that he would be defeated and cast out, knew that he was fighting for failure. Why was God so unpopular? Why were the angels so bad? According to the Christians, these angels were spirits. They'd never been corrupted by flesh, by the passion of love. Why were they so wicked? Why did God create those angels, knowing that they would rebel? Why did he deliberately sow the seeds of discord in heaven, knowing that he would cast them into the lake of eternal fire, knowing that for them he would create the eternal prison, whose dungeons would echo forever the sobs and shrieks of endless pain? How foolish is infinite wisdom, how malicious is mercy, how revengeful is boundless love. Again I say that no sensible man in all the world believes in devils. Why does God allow these devils to enjoy themselves at the expense of his ignorant children? Why does he allow them to leave their prison? Does he give them furloughs or tickets of leave? Does he want his children misled and corrupted so that he can have the pleasure of damning their souls? Some of the preachers who have answered me say that I am fighting a man of straw. I am fighting the supernatural, the dogma of inspiration, the belief in devils, the atonement, salvation by faith, the forgiveness of sins, and the savagery of eternal pain. I am fighting the absurd, the monstrous, the cruel. The ministers pretend that they have advanced, that they do not believe the things that I attack. In this they are not honest. Who is the man of straw? The man of straw is their master. In every orthodox pulpit stands this man of straw, stands beside the preacher, stands with a club called a creed in his upraised hand. The shadow of this club falls athwart the open Bible, falls upon the preacher's brain, darkens the light of his reason, and compels him to betray himself. The man of straw rules every sectarian school and college, every orthodox church. He is the censor who passes on every sermon. Now and then some minister puts a little sense in his discourse, tries to take a forward step, down comes the club, and the man of straw demands an explanation, a retraction. If the minister takes it back, good. If he does not, he is brought to book. The man of straw put the plaster of silence on the lips of Professor Briggs, and he was forced to leave the church or remain dumb. The man of straw closed the mouth of Professor Smith, and he has not opened it since. The man of straw would not allow the Presbyterian creed to be changed. The man of straw took Father McGlynn by the collar, forced him to his knees, made him take back his words and ask forgiveness for having been abused. The man of straw pitched Professor Swing out of the pulpit and drove the Reverend Mr. Thomas from the Methodist Church. Let me tell the Orthodox ministers that they are trying to cover their retreat. You have given up the geology and the astronomy of the Bible. You have admitted that its history is untrue. You are retreating still. You are giving up the dogma of inspiration. You have your doubts about the flood and Babel. You have given up the witches and wizards. You're beginning to throw away the miraculous. You have killed the little devils, and in a little while you will murder the devil himself. In a few years you will take the Bible for what it is worth. The good and true will be treasured in the heart. The foolish, the infamous, will be thrown away. The man of straw will then be dead. Of course, the real old petrified Orthodox Christian will cling to the devil. He expects to have all of his sins charged to the devil, and at the same time he will be credited with all the virtues of Christ. Upon this showing on the books, upon this balance, he will be entitled to his halo and harp. What a glorious, what an equitable transaction! The sorcerer Superstition changes debt to credit. He waves his wand, and he who deserves the tortures of hell receives an eternal reward. But if a man lacks faith, the scheme is exactly reversed. While in one case a soul is rewarded for the virtues of another, in the other case a soul is damned for the sins of another. This is justice when it blossoms in mercy. Beyond this, idiocy cannot go. Keep the devils out of children. William Kingdon Clifford, one of the greatest men of this century, said, "If there is one lesson that history forces upon us in every page, it is this: keep your children away from the priest, or he will make them the enemies of mankind." In every Orthodox Sunday school, children are taught to believe in devils. Every little brain becomes a menagerie filled with wild beasts from hell. The imagination is polluted with the deformed, the monstrous and malicious. To fill the minds of children with leering fiends, with mocking devils, is one of the meanest and basest of crimes. In these pious prisons, these divine dungeons, these Protestant and Catholic inquisitions, children are tortured with these cruel lies. Here they are taught that to really think is wicked, that to express your honest thought is blasphemy, and that to live a free and joyous life depending on fact instead of faith is the sin against the Holy Ghost. Children thus taught, thus corrupted and deformed, become the enemies of investigation, of progress. They are no longer true to themselves. They have lost the veracity of the soul. In the language of Professor Clifford, they are the enemies of the human race. So I say to all fathers and mothers, keep your children away from priests, away from orthodox Sunday schools, away from the slaves of superstition. They will teach them to believe in the devil, in hell, in the prison of God, in the eternal dungeon, where the souls of men are to suffer forever. These frightful things are a part of Christianity. Take these lies from the creed, and the whole scheme falls into shapeless ruin. This dogma of hell is the infinite of savagery, the dream of insane revenge. It makes God a wild beast, an infinite hyena. It makes Christ as merciless as the fangs of a viper. Save poor children from the pollution of this horror. Protect them from this infinite lie. I admit that there are many good and beautiful passages in the Old and New Testament, that from the lips of Christ dropped many pearls of kindness, of love. Every verse that is true and tender I treasure in my heart. Every thought behind which is the tear of pity I appreciate and love. But I cannot accept it all. Many utterances attributed to Christ shock my brain and heart. They are absurd and cruel. Take from the New Testament the infinite savagery, the shoreless malevolence of eternal pain, the absurdity of salvation by faith, the ignorant belief in the existence of devils, the immorality and cruelty of the atonement, the doctrine of non-resistance that denies to virtue the right of self-defense, and how glorious it would be to know that the remainder is true. Compared with this knowledge, how everything else in nature would shrink and shrivel. What ecstasy would be to know that God exists, that He is our Father, and that He loves and cares for the children of men. To know that all the paths that human beings travel, turn and wind as they may, lead to the gates of stainless peace. How the heart would thrill and throb to know that Christ was the conqueror of death, that at his grave the all-devouring monster was baffled and beaten forever, that from that moment the tomb became the door that opens on eternal life. To know this would change all sorrow into gladness. Poverty, failure, disaster, defeat, power, place, and wealth would become meaningless sounds. To take your babe upon your knee and say, "Mine and mine forever." What joy! To clasp the woman you love in your arms and to know that she is yours and forever. Yours though suns darken and constellations vanish. This is enough, to know that the loved and dead are not lost, that they still live and love and wait for you, to know that Christ dispelled the darkness of death and filled the grave with eternal light. To know this would be all that the heart could bear. Beyond this, joy cannot go. Beyond this, there is no place for hope. How beautiful, how enchanting death would be. How we would long to see his fleshless skull. What rays of glory would stream from his sightless sockets, and how the heart would long for the touch of his stilling hand. The shroud would become a robe of glory, the funeral procession a harvest home, and the grave would mark the end of sorrow, the beginning of eternal joy. And yet it were better far that all this should be false than that all of the New Testament should be true. It is far better to have no heaven than to have heaven and hell. Better to have no God than God and devil. Better to rest in eternal sleep than to be an angel and know that the ones you love are suffering eternal pain. Better to live a free and loving life, a life that ends forever at the grave, than to be an immortal slave. The Master cannot be great enough to make slavery sweet. I have no ambition to become a winged servant, a winged slave. Better eternal sleep. But they say, if you give up these superstitions, what have you left? Let me now give you the declaration of a creed. Declaration of the free. We have no falsehoods to defend. We want the facts. Our force, our thought, we do not spend in vain attacks, and we will never meanly try to save some fair and pleasing lie. The simple truth is what we ask, not the ideal. We've set ourselves the noble task to find the real. If all there is naught but dross, we want to know, and bear our loss. We will not willingly be fooled by fables nursed. Our hearts by earnest thought are schooled to bear the worst. And we can stand erect and dare all things, all facts that really are. We have no God to serve or fear, no hell to shun, no devil with malicious leer. When life is done, an endless sleep may close our eyes, a sleep with neither dreams nor sighs. We have no master on the land, no king in air. Without a manacle we stand, without a prayer. Without a fear of coming night, we seek the truth, we love the light. We do not bow before a guess, a vague unknown, a senseless force we do not bless in solemn tone. When evil comes we do not curse, or thank because it is no worse. When cyclones rend, when lightning blights, 'tis naught but fate. There is no God of wrath who smites in heartless hate. Behind the things that injure man there is no purpose, thought, or plan. We waste no time in useless dread, in trembling fear. The present lives, the past is dead, and we are here, all welcome guests at life's great feast. We need no help from ghost or priest. Our life is joyous, jocund, free. Not one a slave who bends in fear the trembling knee and seeks to save a coward soul from future pain. Not one will cringe or crawl for gain. The jeweled cup of love we drain, and friendship's wine now swiftly flows in every vein with warmth divine. And so we love and hope and dream that in death's sky there is a gleam. We walk according to our light, pursue the path that leads to honor's stainless height, careless of wrath, or curse of God, or priestly spite, longing to know and do the right. We love our fellow man, our kind, wife, child, and friend. To phantoms we are deaf and blind, but we extend the helping hand to the distressed. By lifting others we are blessed. Love's sacred flame within the heart and friendship's glow, while all the miracles of art their wealth bestow upon the thrilled and joyous brain, and present raptures banish pain. We love no phantoms of the skies, but living flesh, with passion's soft and soulful eyes, lips warm and fresh, and cheeks with health's red flag unfurled, the breathing angels of this world. The hands that help are better far than lips that pray. Love is the ever-gleaming star that leads the way, that shines not on vague worlds of bliss, but on a paradise in this. We do not pray or weep or wail. We have no dread, no fear to pass beyond the veil that hides the dead, and yet we question, dream, and guess, but knowledge we do not possess. We ask, yet nothing seems to know. We cry in vain. There is no master of the show who will explain or from the future tear the mask, and yet we dream and still we ask. Is there beyond the silent night an endless day? Is death a door that leads to light? We cannot say. The tongueless secret, locked in fate, we do not know. We hope and wait.
End of Part 2.
Section 14 of the works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, Lectures, Dresden edition, published 1900. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4. Progress, Part 1. This is the first lecture ever delivered by Mr. Ingersoll. The stars indicate the word missing in the manuscript. Recording note. Indicated by... End of note. It was delivered in Pekin, Illinois, in 1860, and again in Bloomington, Illinois, in 1864. It is admitted by all that happiness is the only good, happiness in its highest and grandest sense, and the most springs of refined, generous conscience tends indirectly, truly we, physically, to develop the wonderful powers of the mind is progress. It is impossible for man to become educated and refined without leisure, and there can be no leisure without wealth, and all wealth is produced by labor, nothing else. Nothing can. The hands. And fabrics. American labor is not honored as it deserves. We should remember that the prosperity of the world depends upon the men who walk in the fresh furrows and through the rustling corn, upon those whose faces are radiant with the glare of furnaces, upon the delvers in dark mines, the workers in shops, upon those who give the wintry air the ringing music of the axe, and upon those who wrestle with the wild waves of the raging sea. And it is from the surplus produced by labor that schools are built, that colleges and universities are founded and endowed. From this surplus the painter is paid for the immortal productions of the pencil. This pays the sculptor for chiseling the shapeless rock into forms of beauty almost divine, and the poet for singing the hopes, the loves, and aspirations of the world. This surplus has erected all the palaces and temples, all the galleries of art, has given to us all the books in which we converse, as it were, with the dead kings of the human race, and has supplied us with all there is of elegance, of beauty, and of refined happiness in the world. I am aware that the subject chosen by me is almost infinite, and that, in its broadest sense, it is absolutely beyond the present comprehension of man. I am also aware that there are many opinions as to what progress really is, that what one calls progress another denominates barbarism, that many have a wonderful veneration for all that is ancient, merely because it is ancient, and they see no beauty in anything from which they do not have to blow the dust of ages with the breath of praise. They say, no masters like the old, no governments like the ancient, no orators, no poets, no statesmen like those who have been dust for 2,000 years. Others despise antiquity and admire only the modern, merely because it is modern. They find so much to condemn in the past that they condemn all. I hope, however, that I have gratitude enough to acknowledge the obligations I am under to the great and heroic minds of antiquity, and that I have manliness and independence enough not to believe what they say merely because they said it, and that I have moral courage enough to advocate ideas, however modern they may be, if I believe that they are right. Truth is neither young nor old, is neither ancient nor modern, but is the same for all times and places, and should be sought for with ceaseless activity, eagerly acknowledged, loved more than life, and abandoned never. In accordance with the idea that labor is the basis of all prosperity and happiness, is another idea or truth, and that is, that labor, in order to make the laborer and the world at large happy, must be free. That the laborer must be a free man, the thinker must be free. I do not intend, in what I may say upon this subject, to carry you back to the remotest antiquity, back to Asia, the cradle of the world, where we could stand in the ashes and ruins of a civilization so old that history has not recorded even its decay. It will answer my present purpose to commence with the Middle Ages. In those times there was no freedom of either mind or body in Europe. Labor was despised, and the laborer was considered as scarcely above the beasts. Ignorance, like a mantle, covered the world, and superstition ran riot with the human imagination. The air was filled with angels, demons, and monsters. Everything assumed the air of the miraculous. Credulity occupied the throne of reason, and faith put out the eyes of the soul. A man to be distinguished had either to be a soldier or a monk. He could take his choice between killing and lying. You must remember that in those days nations carried on war as an end, not as a means. War and theology were the business of mankind. No man could win more than a bare existence by industry, much less fame and glory. Comparatively speaking, there was no commerce. Nations, instead of buying and selling from and to each other, took what they wanted by brute force. And every Christian country maintained that it was no robbery to take the property of Mohammedans, and no murder to kill the owners with or without just cause of quarrel. Lord Bacon was the first man of note who maintained that a Christian country was bound to keep its plighted faith with an infidel one. In those days reading and writing were considered very dangerous arts, and any layman who had acquired the art of reading was suspected of being a heretic or a wizard. It is almost impossible for us to conceive of the ignorance, the cruelty, the superstition, and the mental blindness of that period. In reading the history of those dark and bloody years, I am amazed at the wickedness, the folly, and presumption of mankind. And yet, the solution of the whole matter is, they despised liberty. They hated freedom of mind and of body. They forged chains of superstition for the one and of iron for the other. They were ruled by that terrible trinity, the cowl, the sword, and chain. You cannot form a correct opinion of those ages without reading the standard authors, so to speak, of that time, the laws then in force, and by ascertaining the habits and customs of the people, their mode of administering the laws, and the ideas that were commonly received as correct. No one believed that honest error could be innocent. No one dreamed of such a thing as religious freedom. In the 15th century the following law was in force in England. Quote, that whatsoever they were that should read the Scriptures in the mother tongue, they should forfeit land, cattle, body, life, and goods from their heirs forever, and so be condemned for heretics to God, enemies to the crown, and most arrant traitors to the land. End of quote. The next year after this law was in force, in one day 39 were hanged for its violation, and their bodies afterward burned. Laws equally unjust, bloody, and cruel were in force in all parts of Europe. In the 16th century a man was burned in France because he refused to kneel to a procession of dirty monks. I could enumerate thousands of instances of the most horrid cruelty perpetrated upon men, women, and even little children, for no other reason in the world than for a difference of opinion upon a subject that neither party knew anything about. But you are all, no doubt, perfectly familiar with the history of religious persecution. There is one thing, however, that is strange indeed, and it is that the reformers of those days, the men who rose against the horrid tyranny of the times, the moment they attained power, persecuted with a zeal and bitterness never excelled. Luther, one of the grand men of the world, cast in the heroic mould, although he gave utterance to the following sublime sentiment. Quote, every one has the right to read for himself, that he may prepare himself to live and to die. End of quote. Still had no idea of what we call religious freedom. He considered universal toleration an error, so did Melanchthon and Erasmus, and yet, strange as it may appear, they were exercising the very right they denied to others, and maintaining the right with a courage and energy absolutely sublime. John Knox was only in favor of religious freedom when he was in the minority, and Baxter entertained the same sentiment. Castalio, a professor of Geneva in Switzerland, was the first clergyman in Europe who declared the innocence of honest error, and who proclaimed himself in favor of universal toleration. The name of this man should never be forgotten. He had the goodness, the courage, although surrounded with prisons and inquisitions, and in the midst of millions of fierce bigots, to declare the innocence of honest error, and that every man had the right to worship the good God in his own way. For the utterance of this sublime sentiment, his professorship was taken from him. He was driven from Geneva by John Calvin and his adherents, although he had belonged to the sect. He was denounced as a child of the devil, a dog of Satan, as a murderer of souls, as a corrupter of the faith, and as one who by his doctrines crucified the Saviour afresh. Not content with merely driving him from his home, they pursued him absolutely to the grave, with a malignity that increased rather than diminished. You must not think that Calvin was alone in this. On the contrary, he was fully sustained by public opinion, and would have been sustained even though he had procured the burning of the noble Castalio at the stake. I cite this instance not merely for the purpose of casting odium upon Calvin, but to show you what public opinion was at the time, when such things were ordinary transactions. Bodinus, a lawyer in France, about the same time advocated something like religious liberty, but public opinion was overwhelmingly against him, and the people were at all times ready with torch and brand, chain and faggot to get the abominable heresy out of the human mind that a man had a right to think for himself. And yet Luther, Calvin, Knox and Baxter, in spite, as it were, of themselves, conferred a great and lasting benefit upon mankind. For what they did was at least in favor of individual judgment, and one successful stand against the Church produced others, all of which tended to establish universal toleration. In those times you will remember that failing to convert a man or woman by the ordinary means, they resorted to every engine of torture that the ingenuity of bigotry could devise. They crushed their feet in what they called iron boots. They roasted them upon slow fires. They plucked out their nails, and then into the bleeding, quick-thrust needles. And all this to convince them of the truth. I suppose that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. Montaigne was the first man who raised his voice against torture in France, a man blessed with so much common sense that he was the most uncommon man of the age in which he lived. But what was one voice against the terrible cry of ignorant millions, a drowning man in the wild roar of the infinite sea? It is impossible to read the history of the long and seemingly hopeless war waged for religious freedom without being filled with horror and disgust. Millions of men, women, and children, at least 100 millions of human beings with hopes and loves and aspirations like ourselves, have been sacrificed upon the altar of bigotry. They have perished at the stake, in prisons, by famine, and by sword. They have died wandering, homeless, in deserts, groping in caves, until their blood cried from the earth for vengeance. But the principle, gathering strength from their weakness, nourished by blood and flame, rendered holier still by their sufferings, grander by their heroism, and immortal by their death, triumphed at last, and is now acknowledged by the whole civilized world. Enormous as the cost has been, the principle is worth 1,000 times as much. There must be freedom in religion, for without freedom there can be no real religion. And as for myself, I glory in the fact that upon American soil that principle was first firmly established, and that the Constitution of the United States was the first of any great nation in which religious toleration was made one of the fundamental laws of the land. And it is not only the law of our country, but the law is sustained by an enlightened public opinion. Without liberty there is no religion, no worship. What light is to the eyes, what air is to the lungs, what love is to the heart, liberty is to the soul of man. Without liberty the brain is a dungeon, where the chained thoughts die with the opinions pressed against the hingeless doors. Witchcraft. The next fact to which I call your attention is, that during the Middle Ages the people, the whole people, the learned and the ignorant, the masters and the slaves, the clergy, the lawyers, doctors and statesmen, all believed in witchcraft, in the evil eye, and that the devil entered into people, into animals, and even into insects, to accomplish his dark designs. And all the people believed it their solemn duty to thwart the devil by all means in their power, and they accordingly set themselves at work, hanging and burning everybody suspected of being in league with the enemy of mankind. If you grant their premises, you justify their actions. If these persons had actually entered into partnership with the devil, for the purpose of injuring their neighbors, the people would have been justified in exterminating them all. And the crime of witchcraft was proven, over and over again, in court after court, in every town of Europe. Thousands of people who were charged with being in league with the devil confessed the crime, gave all the particulars of the bargain, told just what the devil said and what he replied, and exactly how the bargain was consummated, admitted in the presence of death, on the very edge of the grave, when they knew that the confession would confiscate all their property and leave the children homeless wanderers, and render their own names infamous after death. We can account for a man suffering death for what he believes to be right. He knows that he has the sympathy of all the truly good, and he hopes that his name will be gratefully remembered in the far future, and above all, he hopes to win the approval of a just God. But the man who confessed himself guilty of being a wizard knew that his memory would be execrated, and expected that his soul would be eternally lost. What motive could then have induced so many to confess? Strange as it is, I believe that they actually believed themselves guilty. They considered their case hopeless, they confessed and died without a prayer. These things are enough to make one think that sometimes the world becomes insane, and that the earth is a vast asylum without a keeper. I repeat that I am convinced that the people that confessed themselves guilty believed that they were so. In the first place, they believed in witchcraft, and that people often were possessed of Satan, and when they were accused, the fright and consternation produced by the accusation, in connection with their belief, often produced insanity, or something akin to it. And the poor creatures charged with a crime that it was impossible to disprove, deserted and abhorred by their friends, left alone with their superstitions and fears, driven to despair, looked upon death as a blessed relief from a torture that you and I cannot at this day understand. People were charged with the most impossible crimes. In the times of James I, a man was burned in Scotland for having produced a storm at sea for the purpose of drowning one of the royal family. A woman was tried before Sir Matthew Hale, one of the most learned and celebrated lawyers of England, for having caused children to vomit crooked pins. She was also charged with nursing demons. Of course she was found guilty, and the learned judge charged the jury that there was no doubt as to the existence of witches, that all history, sacred and profane, and that the experience of every country proved it beyond any manner of doubt. And the woman was either hanged or burned for a crime for which it was impossible for her to be guilty. In those times they also believed in lycanthropy, that is, that persons of whom the devil had taken possession could assume the appearance of wolves. One instance is related where a man was attacked by what appeared to be a wolf. He defended himself and succeeded in cutting off one of the wolf's paws, whereupon the wolf ran, and the man picked up the paw and, putting it in his pocket, went home. When he took the paw out of his pocket, it had changed to a human hand, and his wife sat in the house with one of her hands gone and the stump of her arm bleeding. He denounced his wife as a witch. She confessed her crime and was burned at the stake. People were burned for causing frosts in summer, for destroying crops with hail, for causing cows to become dry, and even for souring beer. The life of no one was secure. Malicious enemies had only to charge one with witchcraft, prove a few odd sayings and queer actions to secure the death of their victim. And this belief in witchcraft was so intense that to express a doubt upon the subject was to be suspected and probably executed. Believing that animals were also taken possession of by evil spirits, and also believing that if they killed an animal containing one of the evil spirits, that they caused the death of the spirit, they absolutely tried animals, convicted and executed them. At Basel, in 1474, a rooster was tried, charged with having laid an egg, and as rooster eggs were used only in making witch ointment, it was a serious charge, and everyone, of course, admitted that the devil must have been the cause. as roosters could not very well lay eggs without some help. And the egg having been produced in court, the rooster was duly convicted, and he, together with his miraculous egg, were publicly, and with all due solemnity, burned in the public square. So a hog and 6 pigs were tried for having killed and partially eaten a child. The hog was convicted and executed, but the pigs were acquitted on the ground of their extreme youth. As late as 1740, a cow was absolutely tried on a charge of being possessed of the devil. Our forefathers used to rid themselves of rats, leeches, locusts, and vermin, pronouncing what they called a public exorcism. On some occasions animals were received as witnesses in judicial proceedings. The law was in some of the countries of Europe that if a man's house was broken into between sunset and sunrise, and the owner killed the intruder, it should be considered justifiable homicide. But it was also considered that it was just possible that a man living alone might entice another to his house in the night time, kill him, and then pretend that this victim was a robber. In order to prevent this, it was enacted that when a person was killed by a man living alone, and under such circumstances, the solitary householder should not be held innocent unless he produced in court some animal, a dog or a cat, that had been an inmate of the house and had witnessed the death of the person killed. The prisoner was then compelled in the presence of such animal to make a solemn declaration of his innocence, and if the animal failed to contradict him, he was declared guiltless. The law taking it for granted that the deity would cause a miraculous manifestation by a dumb animal, rather than allow a murderer to escape. It was the law in England that anyone convicted of a crime could appeal to what was called corsned or morsel of execration. This was a piece of cheese or bread of about an ounce in weight, which was first consecrated with a form of exorcism, desiring that the Almighty, if the man were guilty, would cause convulsions and paleness, and that it might stick in his throat, but that it might, if the man were innocent, turn to health and nourishment. Godwin, the Earl of Kent, during the reign of Edward the Confessor, appealed to the corsned, which, sticking in his throat, produced death. There were also trials by water and by fire. Persons were made to handle red-hot iron, and if it burned them, their guilt was established. So their hands and feet were tied, and they were thrown into the water, and if they sank, they were pronounced guilty and allowed to drown. I give these instances to show you what has happened, and what always will happen, in countries where ignorance prevails, and people abandon the great standard of reason, and also to show to you that scarcely any man, however great, can free himself of the superstitions of his time. Kepler, one of the greatest men of the world, and an astronomer second to none, although he plucked from the stars the secrets of the universe, was an astrologer, and thought he could predict the career of any man by finding what star was in the ascendant at his birth. This infinitely foolish stuff was religiously believed by him, merely because he had been raised in an atmosphere of boundless credulity. Tycho Brahe, another astronomer, who has been and is called the Prince of Astronomers, not only believed in astrology, but actually kept an idiot in his service, whose disconnected and meaningless words he carefully wrote down, and then put them together in such a manner as to make prophecies. And then he patiently and confidently awaited their fulfillment. Luther believed that he had actually seen the devil not only, but that he had had discussions with him upon points of theology. On one occasion, getting excited, he threw an inkstand at his Majesty's head, and the ink stain is still to be seen on the wall where the stand was broken. The devil, I believe, was untouched. He probably, having an inkling of Luther's intention, made a successful dodge. In the time of Charles V, Emperor of Germany, Stoeffler, a noted mathematician and astronomer, a man of great learning, made an astronomical calculation according to the great science of astrology, and ascertained that the world was to be visited by another deluge. This prediction was absolutely believed by the leading men of the empire not only, but of all Europe. The Commissioner General of the army of Charles V recommended that a survey be made of the country by competent men in order to find out the highest land. But as it was uncertain how high the water would rise, this idea was abandoned. Thousands of people left their homes in low lands, by the rivers and near the sea, and sought the more elevated ground. Immense suffering was produced. People in some instances abandoned the aged, the sick, and the infirm to the tender mercies of the expected flood, so anxious were they to reach some place of security. At Toulouse, in France, the people actually built an ark and stocked it with provisions, and it was not till long after the day upon which the flood was to have come had passed that the people recovered from their fright and returned to their homes. About the same time it was currently reported and believed that a child had been born in Silesia with a golden tooth. The people were again filled with wonder and consternation. They were satisfied that some great evil was coming upon mankind. At last it was solved by some chapter in Daniel, wherein is predicted somebody with a golden head. Such stories would never have gained credence only for the reason that the supernatural was expected. Anything in the ordinary course of nature was not worth telling. The human mind was in chains, it had been deformed by slavery. Reason was a trembling coward, and every production of the mind was deformed, every idea was a monster. Almost every law was unjust. The religion was nothing more or less than monsters worshipping an imaginary monster. Science could not, properly speaking, exist. Their histories were the grossest and most palpable falsehoods, and they filled all Europe with the most shocking absurdities. The histories were all written by the monks and bishops, all of whom were intensely superstitious and equally dishonest. Everything they did was a pious fraud. They wrote as if they had been eye-witnesses of every occurrence that they related. They entertained and consequently expressed no doubt as to any particular, and in case of any difficulty they always had a few miracles ready, just suited for the occasion, and the people never for an instant doubted the absolute truth of every statement that they made. They wrote the history of every country of any importance. They related all the past and present, and predicted nearly all the future, with an ignorant impudence actually sublime. They traced the order of St. Michael in France back to the Archangel himself, and alleged that he was the founder of a chivalric order in heaven itself. They also said that the Tartars originally came from hell, and that they were called Tartars because Tartarus was one of the names of perdition. They declared that Scotland was so called after Scotta, a daughter of Pharaoh, who landed in Ireland and afterward invaded Scotland and took it by force of arms. This statement was made in a letter addressed to the Pope in the 14th century, and was alluded to as a well-known fact. The letter was written by some of the highest dignitaries of the Church and by direction of the king himself. Matthew of Paris, an eminent historian of the 13th century, gave the world the following piece of valuable information. Quote, "It is well known that Mohammed originally was a cardinal, and became a heretic because he failed in his design of being elected pope." End of quote. The same gentleman informs us that Mohammed, having drank to excess, fell drunk by the roadside, and in that condition was killed by pigs. And this is the reason, says he, that his followers abhor pork even unto this day. Another historian, of about the same period, tells us that one of the popes cut off his hand because it had been kissed by an improper person, and that the hand was still in the Lateran at Rome, where it had been miraculously preserved from corruption for over 500 years. After that occurrence, says he, the Pope's toe was substituted, which accounts for this practice. He also has the goodness to inform his readers that Nero was in the habit of vomiting frogs. Some of the croakers of the present day against progress would, I think, be the better of such a vomit. The history of Charlemagne was written by Turpin, the Archbishop of Rheims, and received the formal approbation of the Pope. In this it is asserted that the walls of a city fell down in answer to prayer, that Charlemagne was opposed by a giant called Finacute, who was a descendant of the ancient Goliath, that 40 men were sent to attack this giant, and that he took them under his arms and quietly carried them away. At last Orlando engaged him singly. Not meeting with the success that he anticipated, he changed his tactics and commenced a theological discussion. Warming with his subject, he pressed forward and suddenly stabbed his opponent, inflicting a mortal wound. After the death of the giant, Charlemagne easily conquered the whole country and divided it among his sons. The history of the Britons, written by the Archdeacons of Monmouth and Oxford, was immensely popular. According to their account, Brutus, a Roman, conquered England, built London, called the country Britain after himself. During his time it rained blood for 3 days. At another time a monster came from the sea, and after having devoured a great many common people, finally swallowed the king himself. They say that King Arthur was not born like ordinary mortals, but was formed by a magical contrivance made by a wizard. That he was particularly lucky in killing giants, that he killed one in France who used to eat several people every day, and that this giant was clothed with garments made entirely of the beards of kings that he had killed and eaten. To cap the climax, one of the authors of this book was promoted for having written an authentic history of his country. Another writer of the 15th century says that after Ignatius was dead, they found impressed upon his heart the Greek word theos. In all historical compositions there was an incredible want of common honesty. The great historian Eusebius ingeniously remarks that in his history he omitted whatever tended to discredit the Church and magnified whatever conduced to her glory. The same glorious principle was adhered to by most, if not all, of the writers of those days. They wrote, and the people believed that the tracks of Pharaoh's chariot wheels were still impressed upon the sands of the Red Sea, and could not be obliterated either by the winds or waves. The next subject to which I call your attention is the wonderful progress in the mechanical arts. Animals use the weapons nature has furnished, and those only: the beak, the claw, the tusk, the teeth. The barbarian uses a club, a stone. As man advances, he makes tools with which to fashion his weapons. He discovers the best material to be used in their construction. The next thing was to find some power to assist him, that is to say, the weight of falling water, or the force of the wind. He then creates a force, so to speak, by changing water to steam, and with that he impels machines that can do almost everything but think. You will observe that the ingenuity of man is first exercised in the construction of weapons. There were splendid Damascus blades when plowing was done with a crooked stick. There were complete suits of armor on backs that had never felt a shirt. The world was full of inventions to destroy life before there were any to prolong it or make it endurable. Murder was always a science. Medicine is not one yet. Scalping was known and practiced long before Barrett discovered the hair regenerator. The destroyers have always been honored. The useful have always been despised. In ancient times agriculture was known only to slaves. The low, the ignorant, the contemptible cultivated the soil. To work was to be nobody. Mechanics were only 1 degree above the farmer. In short, labor was disgraceful. Idleness was the badge of gentle blood. The fields being poorly cultivated produced but little at the best. Only a few kinds of crops were raised. The result was frequent famine and constant suffering. One country could not be supplied from another, as now. The roads were always horrible, and besides all this, every country was at war with nearly every other. This state of things lasted until a few years ago. Let me show you the condition of England at the beginning of the 18th century. At that time London was the most populous capital in Europe, yet it was dirty, ill-built, without any sanitary provisions whatever. The deaths were 1 in 23 each year. Now, in a much more crowded population, they are not 1 in 40. Much of the country was then heath and swamp. Almost within sight of London there was a tract, 25 miles round, almost in a state of nature. There were but 3 houses upon it. In the rainy season the roads were almost impassable. Through gullies filled with mud, carriages were dragged by oxen. Between places of great importance the roads were little known, and the principal mode of transport was by pack horses, of which passengers took advantage by stowing themselves away between the packs. The usual charge for freight was 30 cents per ton a mile. After a while, what they were pleased to call flying coaches were established. They could move from 30 to 50 miles a day. Many persons thought the risk so great that it was tempting Providence to get into one of them. The mailbag was carried on horseback at 5 miles an hour. A penny post had been established in the city, but many long-headed men, who knew what they were saying, denounced it as a popish contrivance. Only a few years before, Parliament had resolved that all pictures in the royal collection which contained representations of Jesus or the Virgin Mary should be burned. Greek statues were handed over to Puritan stonemasons to be made decent. Lewis Maggleton had given himself out as the last and the greatest of the prophets, having power to save or damn. He had also discovered that God was only 6 feet high and the sun 4 miles off. There were people in England as savage as our Indians. The women, half naked, would chant some wild measure, while the men would brandish their dirks and dance. There were 34 counties, without a printer. Social discipline was wretched. The master flogged his apprentice, the pedagogue his scholar, the husband his wife. And I am ashamed to say that whipping has not been abolished in our schools. It is a relic of barbarism, and should not be tolerated one moment. It is brutal, low, and contemptible. The teacher that administers such punishment is no more to blame than the parents that allow it. Every gentleman and lady should use his or her influence to do away with this vile and infamous practice. In those days public punishments were all brutal. Men and women were put in the pillory and then pelted with brickbats, rotten eggs, and dead cats by the rabble. The whipping post was then an institution in England as it is now in the enlightened state of Delaware. Criminals were drawn and quartered, others were disemboweled and hung, and their bodies suspended in chains to rot in the air. The houses of the people in the country were huts thatched with straw. Anybody who could get fresh meat once a week was considered rich. Children 6 years old had to labor. In London the houses were of wood or plaster, the streets filthy beyond expression, even muddier than Bloomington is now. After nightfall a passenger went about at his peril, for chamber windows were opened and slop pails unceremoniously emptied. There were no lamps in the streets, but plenty of highwaymen and robbers. The morals of the people corresponded, as they generally do, to their physical condition. It is said that the clergy did what they could to make the people pious, but they could not accomplish much. You cannot convert a man when he is hungry. He will not accept better doctrines until he gets better clothes, and he won't have more faith till he gets more food. Besides this, the clergy were a little below par, so much so that Queen Elizabeth issued an order that no clergyman should presume to marry a servant girl without the consent of her master or mistress. During the same time the condition of France, and indeed of all Europe, was even worse than England. What has changed the condition of Great Britain? More than any and everything else, the inventions of her mechanics. The old moral method was and always will be a failure. If you wish to better the condition of a people morally, better them physically. About the close of the 18th century, Watt, Arkwright, Hargreave, Crompton, Cartwright invented the steam engine, the spring frame, the jenny, the mule, the power loom, the carding machine, and 100 other minor inventions, and put it in the power of England to monopolize the markets of the world. Her machinery soon became equal to 30 million of men. In a few years the population was doubled, and the wealth quadrupled, and England became the first nation of the world through her inventors, her merchants, her mechanics, and, in spite of her statesmen, her priests, and her nobles. England began to spin for the world. Cotton began to be universally worn. Clean shirts began to be seen. The most cunning spinners of India could make a thread over 100 miles long from 1 pound of cotton. The machines of England have produced one over 1,000 miles in length from the same quantity. In a short time Stephenson invented the locomotive. Railroads began to be built. Fulton gave to the world the steamboat, and commerce became independent of the winds. There are already railroads enough in the United States to make a double track around the world. Man has lengthened his arms. He reaches to every country and takes what he wants. The world is before him. He helps himself. There can be no more famine. If there is no food in this country, the boat and the car will bring it from another. We can have the luxuries of every climate. A majority of the people now live better than the king used to do. Poor Solomon, with his 1,000 wives and no carpets, his great temple and no gaslight, 1,000 women and not a pin in the house, no stoves, no cooking range, no baking powder, no potatoes. Think of it! Breakfast without potatoes. Plenty of wisdom and old saws, but no green corn. Never heard of succotash in his whole life. No clean clothes, no music if you accept the Jew's harp, no ice water, no skates, no carriages, because there was not a decent road in all his dominions. Plenty of theology, but no tobacco, no books, no pictures, not a picture in all Palestine, not a piece of statuary, not a plough that would scour. No tea, no coffee. He never heard of any place of amusement, never was at a theatre or a circus. 7-Up was then unknown to the world. He couldn't even play billiards, with all his knowledge, never had an idea of women's rights or universal suffrage. Never went to school a day in his life, and cared no more about the will of the people than Andy Johnson. The inventors have helped more than any other class to make the world what it is. The workers and the thinkers, the poor and the grand, labor and learning, industry and intelligence, Watt and Descartes, Fulton and Montaigne, Stephenson and Kepler, Crompton and Comte, Franklin and Voltaire, Morse and Buckle, Draper and Spencer, and hundreds more that I could mention. The inventors, the workers, the thinkers, the mechanics, the surgeons, the philosophers, these are the atlases upon whose shoulders rests the great fabric of modern civilization. Language. In order to show you that the most abject superstition pervaded every department of human knowledge, or of ignorance rather, allow me to give you a few of their ideas upon language. It was universally believed that all languages could be traced back to the Hebrew, that the Hebrew was the original language, and every fact inconsistent with that idea was discarded. In consequence of this belief, all efforts to investigate the science of language were utterly fruitless. After a time, the Hebrew idea falling into disrepute, other languages claimed the honor of being the original ones. André Kemp published a work in 1569 on the language of paradise, in which he maintained that God spoke to Adam in Swedish, that Adam answered in Danish, and that the serpent, which appears quite probable, spoke to Eve in French. Hérault, in a book published at Madrid, took the ground that Basque was the language spoken in the Garden of Eden. But in 1580 Gropius published his celebrated work at Antwerp, in which he put the whole matter at rest by proving that the language spoken in paradise was nothing more or less than plain Holland Dutch. The real founder of the present science of language was a German, Leibniz, a contemporary of Sir Isaac Newton. He discarded the idea that all language could be traced to an original one, that language was, so to speak, a natural growth. Actual experience teaches us that this must be true. The ancient sages of Egypt had a vocabulary, according to Bunsen, of only about 685 words, exclusive of proper names. The English language has at least 100,000. End of Progress, Part 1. Recording by Julie Niedermaier. Section 15 of the works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, Lectures. Dresden edition, published 1900. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4. Progress, Part 2. Geography. In the 6th century, a monk by the name of Cosmas wrote a kind of orthodox geography and astronomy combined. He pretended that it was all in accordance with the Bible. According to him, the world was composed, first, of a flat piece of land and circular. This piece of land was entirely surrounded by water, which was the ocean, and beyond the strip of water was another circle of land. This outside circle was the land inhabited by the old world before the flood. Noah crossed the strip of water and landed on the central piece where we now are. On the outside land was a high mountain around which the sun and moon revolved. When the sun was behind the mountain, it was night, and when on the side next to us, it was day. He also taught that on the outer edge of the outside circle of land the firmament or sky was fastened, that it was made of some solid material and turned over the world like an immense kettle. And it was declared at that time that anyone who believed either more or less on that subject than that book contained was a heretic, and deserved to be exterminated from the face of the earth. This was authority until the discovery of America by Columbus. Cosmas said the earth was flat. If it was round, how could man on the other side, at the day of judgment, see the coming of the Lord? At the risk of being tiresome, I have said what I have, to show you the productions of the mind when enslaved, the consequences of abandoning judgment and reason, the effects of widespread ignorance and universal bigotry. I want to convince you that every wrong is a viper that will sooner or later strike with poisoned fangs the bosom that nourishes it. You will ask what has produced this wonderful change in only 300 years. You will remember that in those days it was said that all ghosts vanished at the dawn of day, that the sprites, the spooks, the hobgoblins, and all the monsters of the imagination fled from the approaching sun. In 1441, printing was invented. In the next century it became a power, and it has been flooding the world with light from that time to this. The press has been the true Prometheus. It has been, so to speak, the trumpet blown by the Gabriel of progress, until, from the graves of ignorance and superstition, the people have leaped to grand and glorious life, spurning with swift feet the dust of an infamous past. When people read, they reason. When they reason, they progress. You must not think that the enemies of progress allowed books to be published or read when they had the power to prevent it. The whole power of the Church, of the government, was arrayed upon the side of ignorance. People found in the possession of books were often executed. Printing, reading, and writing were crimes. Anathemas were hurled from the Vatican against all who dared to publish a word in favor of liberty or the sacred rights of man. The Inquisition was founded on purpose to crush out every noble aspiration of the heart. It was a war of darkness against light, of slavery against liberty, of superstition against reason. I shall not attempt to recount the horrors and tortures of the Inquisition. Suffice it to say that they were equal to the most terrible and vivid pictures even of hell, and the inquisitors were even more horrid fiends than even a real perdition could boast. But in spite of priests, in spite of kings, in spite of mitres, in spite of crowns, in spite of cardinals and popes, books were published, and books were read. Beam after beam of light penetrated the darkness. Star after star arose in the firmament of ignorance. The morning of freedom began to dawn. Driven to madness by the prospect of ultimate defeat, the enemies of light persecuted with redoubled fury. People were burned for saying that the earth was round, for saying that the sun was the center of a system. A woman was executed because she endeavored to allay the pains of a fever by singing. The very name of philosopher became a title of proscription, and the slightest offenses were punished by death. About the beginning of the 16th century, Luther and Jerome of Prague inaugurated the Great Reformation in Germany. Ziska was at work in Hungary, Zwinglius in Switzerland. The grand work went forward in Denmark, in Sweden, and in England. All this was accomplished as early as 1534. They unmasked corruption and withstood the tyranny of the Church. With a zeal amounting to enthusiasm, with a courage that was heroic, with an energy that never flagged, a determination that brooked no opposition, with a firmness that defied torture and death, this sublime band of reformers sprang to the attack. Stronghold after stronghold was carried, and in a few short but terrible years the banner of the Reformation waved in triumph over the bloody ensign of St. Peter. The soul, roused from the slumbers of 1,000 years, began to think. When slaves begin to reason, slavery begins to die. The invention of powder had released millions from the army, and left them to prosecute the arts of peace. Industry began to be remunerative and respectable. Science began to unfold the wings that will finally fill the heavens. Descartes announced to the world the sublime truth that the universe is governed by law. Commerce began to unfold her wings. People of different countries began to get acquainted. Christians found that Mohammedan gold was not the less valuable on account of the doctrines of its owners. Telescopes began to be pointed toward the stars. The universe was getting immense. The earth was growing small. It was discovered that a man could be healthy without being a Catholic. Innumerable agencies were at work dispelling darkness and creating light. The supernatural began to be abandoned, and mankind endeavored to account for all physical phenomena by physical laws. The light of reason was irradiating the world, and from that light, as from the approach of the sun, the ghosts and spectres of superstition wrapped their sheets around their attenuated bodies and vanished into thin air. Other inventions rapidly followed. The wonderful power of steam was made known to the world by Watts and by Fulton. Neptune was frightened from the sea. The locomotive was given to mankind by Stephenson, the telegraph by Franklin and Morse. The rush of the ship, the scream of the locomotive, and the electric flash have frightened the monsters of ignorance from the world, and have left nothing above us but the heaven's eternal blue, filled with glittering planets wheeling through immensity in accordance with law. True religion is a subordination of the passions and interests to the perceptions of the intellect. But when religion was considered the end of life instead of a means of happiness, it overshadowed all other interests and became the destroyer of mankind. It became a hydra-headed monster, a serpent reaching in terrible coils from the heavens and thrusting its 1,000 fangs into the bleeding, quivering hearts of men. Slavery. I have endeavored, thus far, to show you some of the results produced by enslaving the human mind. I now call your attention to another terrible phase of this subject, the enslavement of the body. Slavery is a very ancient institution, yes, but about as ancient as robbery, theft, and murder, and is based upon them all. Springing from the same fountain that a man is not the owner of his soul, is the doctrine that he is not the owner of his body. The two are always found together, supported by precisely the same arguments, and attended by the same infamous acts of cruelty. From the earliest time, slavery has existed in all countries and among all people until recently. Pufendorf said that slavery was originally established by contract. Voltaire replied, quote, "Show me the original contract, and if it is signed by the party that was to be a slave, I will believe you." End of quote. You will bear in mind that the slavery of which I am now speaking is white slavery. Greeks enslaved one another as well as those captured in war. Coriolanus scrupled not to make slaves of his own countrymen captured in civil war. Julius Caesar sold to the highest bidder at one time 53,000 prisoners of war, all of whom were white. Hannibal exposed to sale 30,000 captives at one time, all of whom were Roman citizens. In Rome, men were sold into bondage in order to pay their debts. In Germany, men often hazarded their freedom on the throwing of dice. The Barbary states held white Christians in slavery in this, the 19th century. There were white slaves in England as late as 1574. There were white slaves in Scotland until the end of the 18th century. These Scotch slaves were colliers and salters. They were treated as real estate, and passed with a deed to the mines in which they worked. It was also the law that no collier could work in any mine except the one to which he belonged. It was also the law that their children could follow no other occupation than that of their fathers. This slavery absolutely existed in Scotland until the beginning of the glorious 19th century. Some of the Roman nobles were the owners of as many as 20,000 slaves. The common people of France were in slavery for 1400 years. They were transferred with land, and women were often seen assisting cattle to pull the plough, and yet people have the impudence to say that black slavery is right, because the blacks have always been slaves in their own country. I answer, so have the whites until very recently. In the good old days, when might was right, and when kings and popes stood by the people and protected the people and talked about holy oil and divine right, the world was filled with slaves. The traveler standing amid the ruins of ancient cities and empires, seeing on every side the fallen pillar and the prostrate wall, asks, why did these cities fall? Why did these empires crumble? And the ghost of the past, the wisdom of ages, answers, these temples, these palaces, these cities, the ruins of which you stand upon, were built by tyranny and injustice. The hands that built them were unpaid. The backs that bore the burdens also bore the marks of the lash. They were built by slaves, to satisfy the vanity and ambition of thieves and robbers. For these reasons, they are dust. Their civilization was a lie. Their laws merely regulated robbery and established theft. They bought and sold the bodies and souls of men, and the mournful winds of desolation, sighing amid their crumbling ruins, is a voice of prophetic warning to those who would repeat the infamous experiment. From the ruins of Babylon, of Carthage, of Athens, of Palmyra, of Thebes, of Rome, and across the great desert, over that sad and solemn sea of sand, from the land of the pyramids, over the fallen Sphinx, and from the lips of Memnon, the same voice, the same warning and uttering the great truth, that no nation founded upon slavery, either of body or mind, can stand. And yet, today, there are thousands upon thousands endeavoring to build the temples and cities and to administer our government upon the old plan. They are makers of brick without straw. They are bowing themselves beneath hods of untempered mortar. They are the babbling builders of another Babel, a Babel of mud upon a foundation of sand. Notwithstanding the experience of antiquity as to the terrible effects of slavery, bondage was the rule, and liberty the exception, during the Middle Ages not only, but for ages afterward. The same causes that led to the liberation of mind also liberated the body. Free the mind, allow man to write and publish and read, and one by one the shackles will drop, broken, in the dust. This truth was always known, and for that reason slaves have never been allowed to read. It has always been a crime to teach a slave. The intelligent prefer death to slavery. Education is the most radical abolitionist in the world. To teach the alphabet is to inaugurate revolution. To build a schoolhouse is to construct a fort. Every library is an arsenal, and every truth is a monitor, ironclad and steel-plated. Do not think that white slavery was abolished without a struggle. The men who opposed white slavery were ridiculed, were persecuted, driven from their homes, mobbed, hanged, tortured, and burned. They were denounced as having only one idea by men who had none. They were called fanatics by men who were so insane as to suppose that the laws of a petty prince were greater than those of the universe. Crime made faces at virtue, and honesty was an outcast beggar. In short, I cannot better describe to you the manner in which the friends of slavery acted at that time than by saying that they acted precisely as they used to do in the United States. White slavery, established by kidnapping and piracy, sustained by torture and infinite cruelty, was defended to the very last. Let me now call your attention to one of the most immediate causes of the abolition of white slavery in Europe. There were during the Middle Ages 3 great classes of people: the common people, the clergy, and the nobility. All these people could, however, be divided into 2 classes, namely, the robbed and the robbers. The feudal lords were jealous of the king afraid of the lords, the clergy always siding with the stronger party. The common people had only to do the work, the fighting, and to pay the taxes, as by the law the property of the nobles was exempt from taxation. The consequence was, in every war between the nobles and the king, each party endeavored by conciliation to get the peasants upon their side. When the clergy were on the side of the king, they created dissension between the people and the nobles by telling them that the nobles were tyrants. When they were on the side of the nobles, they told the people that the king was a tyrant. At last, the people believed both, and the old adage was verified that when thieves fall out, honest men get their dues. By virtue of the civil and religious wars of Europe, slavery was abolished, and the French Revolution, one of the grandest pages in all history, was, so to speak, the exterminator of white slavery. In that terrible period, the people who had borne the yoke for 1400 years, rising from the dust, casting the shackles from them, fiercely avenged their wrongs. A mob of 20 millions driven to desperation, in the sublimity of despair, in the sacred name of liberty, cried for vengeance. They reddened the earth with the blood of their masters. They trampled beneath their feet the great army of human vermin that had lived upon their labor. They filled the air with the ruins of temples and thrones, and with bloody hands tore in pieces the altar upon which their rites had been offered by an impious church. They scorned the superstitions of the past not only, but they scorned the past, for the past to them was only wrong, imposition, and outrage. The French Revolution was the inauguration of a new era. The lava of freedom, long buried beneath a mountain of wrong and injustice, at last burst forth, overwhelming the Pompeii and Herculaneum of priestcraft and tyranny. As soon as white slavery began to decay in Europe, and while the condition of the white slaves was improving about the middle of the 16th century in 1541, Alonso Gonzalez of Portugal pointed out to his countrymen a new field of operations, a new market for human flesh, and in a short time the African slave trade, with all its unspeakable horrors, was inaugurated. This trade has been the great crime of modern times. It is almost impossible to conceive that nations who profess to be Christian, or even in any degree civilized, should have engaged in this infamous traffic. Yet nearly all of the nations of Europe engaged in the slave trade, legalized it, protected it, fostered the practice, and vied with each other in acts, the bare recital of which is enough to make the heart stand still. It has been calculated that for years at least 400,000 Africans were either killed or enslaved annually. They crammed their ships so full of these unfortunate wretches that, as a general thing, about 10% died of suffocation on the voyage. They were treated like wild beasts. In times of danger they were thrown into the sea. Remember that this horrible traffic commenced in the middle of the 16th century, was carried on by nations pretending to Christian civilization. And when, do you think, it was abolished by some of the principal countries? In England, Wilberforce and Clarkson dedicated their lives to the abolition of the slave trade. They were hated and despised. They persevered for 20 years, and it was not until the 25th of March, 1808, that England pronounced the infamous traffic in human flesh illegal, and the rejoicing in England was redoubled on receiving the news that the United States had done the same thing. After a time, those engaged in the slave trade were declared pirates. On the 28th day of August, 1833, England abolished slavery throughout the British colonies, thus giving liberty to nearly 1 million slaves. The United States was then the greatest slaveholding power in the civilized world. We are all acquainted with the history of slavery in this country. We know that it corrupted our people, that it has drenched our land in fraternal blood, that it has clad our country in mourning for the loss of 300,000 of her bravest sons, that it carried us back to the darkest ages of the world, that it led us to the very brink of destruction, forced us to the shattered gates of eternal ruin, death, and annihilation. But liberty rising above party prejudice, freedom lifting itself above all other considerations. Quote, "As some tall cliff that lifts its awful form, swells from the vale, and midway leaves the storm, though round its breast the rolling clouds are spread, eternal sunshine settles on its head." End of quote. And on the 1st day of January, 1863, the grandest new year that ever dawned upon this continent, in accordance with the will of the heroic North, by the sublime act of one whose name will be sacred through all the coming years, the justice so long delayed was accomplished, and 4 millions of slaves became chainless. Liberty triumphed. Liberty, that most sacred word, without which all other words are vain, without which life is worse than death, and men are beasts. I never see the word liberty without seeing a halo of glory around it. It is a word worthy of the lips of a god. Can you realize the fact that only a few years ago the most shocking system of slavery, the most barbarous, existed in our country, and that you and I were bound by the laws of the United States to stand between a human being and his liberty? That we were absolutely compelled by law to hand back that human being to the lash and chain? That by our laws children were sold from the arms of mothers, wives sold from their husbands? That we executed our laws with the assistance of bloodhounds owned and trained by human bloodhounds fiercer still, and that all this was not only upheld by politicians, but by the pretended ministers of Christ? That the pulpit was in partnership with the auction block? That the bloodhound's bark was only an echo from many of the churches? And that this was all done under the sacred name of liberty, by a republican government that was founded upon the sublime declaration that all men are equal? This all seems to me like a horrible dream, a nightmare of terror, a hellish impossibility. And yet, with cheeks glowing and burning with shame, before the bar of history we are forced to plead guilty to this terrible charge. We made the whipping post of the cross of Christ. It is true that in a great degree we have atoned for this national crime. Our bravest and our best have been sacrificed. We have borne the bloody burden of war. The good and the true have been with us, and the women of the North have won glory imperishable. They robbed war of half its terrors. Not content with binding the wreath of victory upon the leader's brow, they bandaged the soldier's wounds. They nerved the living, comforted the dying, and smiled upon the great victory through their tears. They have consoled the hero's widow, and are educating his orphans. They have erected a monument to enlightened charity, to which time can add only grandeur. There is much, however, to be accomplished still. Slavery has been abolished, but progress requires more. We are called upon to make this a free government in the broadest sense, to give liberty to all. Standing in the presence of all history, knowing the experience of mankind, knowing that the earth is covered with countless wrecks of cruel failures, by the great army of martyrs and heroes who have gone before, by the sacred dust filling innumerable graves, by the memory of our own noble dead, by all the suffering of the past, by all the hopes for the future, by all the glorious dead and countless millions yet to be, I pray, I beseech, I implore the American people to lay the foundation of the government upon the principles of eternal justice. I pray, I beseech, I implore them to take for the cornerstone universal human liberty, the stone which has been heretofore rejected by all the builders of nations. The government will then stand, and the swelling dome of the temple will touch the stars. Conclusion. I have thus endeavored to show you some of the effects of slavery, and to prove to you that a step, in order to be in the direction of progress, must be in the direction of freedom, that slavery either of body or mind is barbarism, and is practiced and defended only by infamous tyrants or their dupes. I have endeavored to point out some of the causes of the abolition of slavery, both of body and mind. There is one truth, however, that you must not forget, and that is, that every evil tends to correct and abolish itself. I believe, however, that the diffusion of knowledge, more than everything else combined, has ameliorated the condition of mankind. When there was no freedom of speech and no press, then every idea perished in the brain that gave it birth. One man could not profit by the thought of another. The experience of the past was in a great degree unknown. And this state of things produced the same effect in the mental world that confining all the water to the springs would in the physical. Confine the water to the springs, the rivulets would cease to murmur, the rivers to flow, and the ocean itself would become a desert of sand. But with the invention of printing, ideas began to circulate, born of the busy brain of the million, little rivulets of facts running into rivers of information, and they all flowing into the great ocean of human knowledge. This exchange of ideas, this comparison of thought, has given to each generation the advantage of all the past. This, more than all else, has enabled man to improve his condition. It is by this that from the log or piece of bark on which a naked savage floated, we have by successive improvements created a man of war, carrying 100 guns and miles of canvas. By these means we have changed a handful of sand into a telescope. In the hands of science a drop of water has become a giant, turning with swift and tireless arms the countless wheels. The sun has become an artist painting with shining beams the very thoughts within our eyes. The elements have been taught to do our bidding, and the electric spark, freighted with human thought and love, defies distance and devours time as it sweeps under all the waves of the sea. These are some of the results of free thought and free labor. I have barely alluded to a few. Where is improvement to stop? Science is only in its infancy. It has accomplished all this and is in its cradle still. We are standing on the shore of an infinite ocean whose countless waves, freighted with blessings, are welcoming our adventurous feet. Progress has been written on every soul. The human race is advancing. Forward, O sublime army of progress! Forward until law is justice! Forward until ignorance is unknown! Forward while there is a spiritual or temporal throne! Forward until superstition is a forgotten dream! Forward until the world is free! Forward until human reason, clothed in the purple of authority, is king of kings. End of Progress by Robert G. Ingersoll. Recording by Niedermaier.
Section 16 of the works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, Lectures, Dresden edition, published 1900. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Herman Roskams. In France, December 2013. The works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4. What is Religion? This was Colonel Ingersoll's last public address, delivered before the American Free Religious Association in the Holy Street Theater, Boston, 2nd of June, 1899. It is asserted that an infinite God created all things, governs all things, and that the creature should be obedient and thankful to the Creator. That the Creator demands certain things, and that the person who complies with these demands is religious. This kind of religion has been substantially universal. For many centuries and by many peoples it was believed that this god demanded sacrifices, that he was pleased when parents shed the blood of their babes. Afterward, it was supposed that he was satisfied with the blood of oxen, lambs, and doves, and that in exchange for or in account of these sacrifices, this god gave rain, sunshine, and harvest. It was also believed that if the sacrifices were not made, this god sent pestilence, famine, flood, and earthquake. The last phase of this belief in sacrifice was, according to the Christian doctrine, that God accepted the blood of his Son, and that after his Son had been murdered, he, God, was satisfied and wanted no more blood. During all these years and by all these peoples, it was believed that this God heard and answered prayer, that he forgave sins and saved the souls of true believers. This, in a general way, is the definition of religion. Now, the questions are whether religion was founded on any known fact, whether such a being as God exists, whether he was the creator of yourself and myself, whether any prayer was ever answered, whether any sacrifice of babe or ox secured the favor of this unseen God. First, did an infinite God create the children of man? Why did he create the intellectually inferior? Why did he create the deformed and helpless? Why did he create the criminal, the idiotic, the insane? Can infinite wisdom and power make any excuse for the creation of failures? Are the failures under obligation to their creator? Second, is an infinite God the governor of this world? Is he responsible for all the chiefs, kings, emperors, and queens? Is he responsible for all the wars that have been waged, for all the innocent blood that has been shed? Is he responsible for the centuries of slavery, for the backs that have been scarred with a lash, for the babes that have been sold from the breasts of mothers, for the families that have been separated and destroyed? Is this God responsible for religious persecution, for the Inquisition, for the thumb, screw, and rack, and for all the instruments of torture? Did this God allow the cruel and vile to destroy the brave and virtuous? Did he allow tyrants to shed the blood of patriots? Did he allow his enemies to torture and burn his friends? What is such a God worth? Would a decent man, having the power to prevent it, allow his enemies to torture and burn his friends? Can we conceive of a devil base enough to prefer his enemies to his friends? If a good and infinitely powerful God governs this world, how can we account for cyclones, earthquakes, pestilence, and famine? How can we account for cancers, for microbes, for diphtheria, and the 1,000 diseases that prey on infancy? How can we account for the wild beasts that devour human beings, for the fanged serpents whose bite is death? How can we account for a world where life feeds on life, where beak and claw, tooth and fang invented and produced by infinite mercy? Did infinite goodness fashion the wings of the eagles so that their fleeing prey could be overtaken? Did infinite goodness create the beasts of prey with the intention that they should devour the weak and helpless? Did infinite goodness create the countless worthless living things that breathe within and feed upon the flesh of higher forms? Did infinite wisdom intentionally produce the microscopic beasts that feed upon the optic nerve? Think of blinding a man to satisfy the appetite of a microbe. Think of the life, feeding on life. Think of the victims. Think of the Niagara of blood pouring over the precipice of cruelty. In view of these facts, what, after all, is religion? It is fear. Fear builds the altar and offers the sacrifice. Fear erects the cathedral and bows the head of man in worship. Fear bends the knees and utters the prayer. Fear pretends to love. Religion teaches the slave virtues, obedience, humility, self-denial, forgiveness, non-resistance. Lips, religious and fearful, tremblingly repeat this passage. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. This is the abyss of degradation. Religion does not teach self-reliance, independence, manliness, courage, self-defense. Religion makes God a master, and man his serf. The master cannot be great enough to make slavery sweet. If this God exists, how do we know that he is good? How can we prove that he is merciful, that he cares for the children of man? If this God exists, he has on many occasions seen millions of his poor children ploughing the fields, sowing and planting the grain, and when he saw them, he knew that they depended on the expected crop for life. And yet this good God, this merciful being, withheld the rain. He caused the sun to rise, to steal all moisture from the land, but gave no rain. He saw the seeds that man had planted wither and perish, but he sent no rain. He saw the people look with sad eyes upon the barren earth, and he sent no rain. He saw them slowly devour the little that they had, and saw them when the days of hunger came. Saw them slowly waste away, saw their hungry sunken eyes, heard their prayers, saw them devour the miserable animals that they had, saw fathers and mothers, insane with hunger, kill and eat their shriveled babes. And yet the heaven above them was as brass, and the earth beneath as iron, and he sent no rain. Can we say that in the heart of this God there blossomed the flower of pity? Can we say that he cared for the children of men? Can we say that his mercy endured forever? Do we prove that this God is good because he sends the cyclone that wrecks villages and covers the fields with the mangled bodies of fathers, mothers, and babes? Do we prove his goodness by showing that he has opened the earth and swallowed thousands of his helpless children, or that with the volcanoes he has overwhelmed them with rivers of fire? Can we infer the goodness of God from the facts we know? If these calamities did not happen, would we suspect that God cared nothing for human beings? If there were no famine, no pestilence, no cyclone, no earthquake, would we think that God is not good? According to the theologians, God did not make all men alike. He made races differing in intelligence, stature, and color. Was there goodness? Was there wisdom in this? Ought the superior race to thank God that they are not the inferior? If we say yes, then I ask another question. Should the inferior races thank God that they are not superior, or should they thank God that they are not beasts? When God made these different races, he knew that the superior would enslave the inferior, knew that the inferior would be conquered and finally destroyed. If God did this, and knew the blood that would be shed, the agonies that would be endured, saw the countless fields covered with the corpses of the slain, saw all the bleeding backs of slaves, all the broken hearts of mothers bereft of babes. If he saw and knew all this, can we conceive a more malicious fiend? Why then should we say that God is good? The dungeons, against whose dripping walls the brave and generous have sighed their souls away, the scaffold stained and glorified with noble blood, the hopeless slaves with scarred and bleeding backs, the writhing martyrs clothed in flame, the virtuous stretchers on racks, their joints and muscles torn apart, the flayed and bleeding bodies of the just, the extinguished eyes of those who sought for truth, the countless patriots who fought and died in vain, the burdened, beaten, weeping wives, the shriveled face of neglected babes, the murdered millions of the vanished years, the victims of the winds and waves, of flood and flame, of imprisoned forces in the air, of lightning stroke, of flavor's molten stream, of famine, plague, and lingering pain, the mouths that drip with blood, the fang that poison, the beaks that wound and tear, the triumphs of the base, the rule and sway of wrong, the crowns that cruelty has worn, and the robed hypocrites with clasped and bloody hands would thank their God. A phantom fiend, that liberty has been banished from the world. These souvenirs of the dreadful past, these horrors that still exist, these frightful facts deny that any God exists who has the will and power to guard and bless the human race. The power that works for righteousness. Most people cling to the supernatural. If they give up one God, they imagine another. Having outgrown Jehovah, they talk about a power that works for righteousness. What is this power? Man advances, and necessarily advances through experience. A man wishing to go to a certain place comes to where the road divides. He takes the left hand, believing it to be the right road, and travels until he finds that it is the wrong one. He retraces his steps and takes the right-hand road, and reaches the place desired. The next time he goes to the same place, he does not take the left-hand road. He has tried that road and knows that it is the wrong road. He takes the right road, and thereupon these theologians say, there is a power that works for righteousness. A child, charmed by the beauty of the flame, grasped it with his dimpled hand. The hand is burnt, and after that, the child keeps its hand out of the fire. The power that works for righteousness had taught the child a lesson. The accumulated experience of the world is a power and force that works for righteousness. This force is not conscious, not intelligent. It has no will, no purpose. It is a result. So thousands have endeavored to establish the existence of God by the fact that we have what is called the moral sense, that is to say, a conscience. It is insisted by these theologians and by many of the so-called philosophers that this moral sense, this sense of duty, of obligation was imported, and that conscience is an exotic, taking the ground that it was not produced here, was not produced by man. They then imagine a God from whom it came. Man is a social being. We live together in families, tribes, and nations. The members of a family, of a tribe, of a nation who increase the happiness of the family, of the tribe, or of the nation are considered good members. They are praised, admired, and respected. They are regarded as good, that is to say, as moral. The members who add to the misery of the family, the tribe, or the nation are considered bad members. They are blamed, despised, punished. They are regarded as immoral. The family, the tribe, the nation creates a standard of conduct, of morality. There is nothing supernatural in this. The greatest of human beings had said, "Conscience is born of love." The sense of obligation, of duty, was naturally produced. Among savages, the immediate consequences of actions are taken into consideration. As people advance, the remote consequences are perceived. The standard of conduct becomes higher. The imagination is cultivated. A man puts himself in the place of another. The sense of duty becomes stronger, more imperative. Man judges himself. He loves, and love is the commencement, the foundation of the highest virtues. He injures one that he loves. Then comes regret, repentance, sorrow, conscience. In all this, there is nothing supernatural. Man has deceived himself. Nature is a mirror in which man sees his own image, and all supernatural religions rest on the pretense that the image which appears to be behind this mirror has been caused. All the metaphysicians of the spiritual type, from Plato to Swedenborg, have manufactured their facts, and all founders of religion have done the same. Suppose that an infinite God exists. What can we do for him? Being infinite, he is conditionless. Being conditionless, he cannot be benefited or endured. He cannot want. He has. Think of the egotism of a man who believes that an infinite being wants his praise. What has our religion done? Of course, it is admitted by Christians that all other religions are false, and consequently, we need examine only our own. Has Christianity done good? Has it made men nobler, more merciful, nearer honest? When the church had control, were men made better and happier? What has been the effect of Christianity in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, in Ireland? What has religion done for Hungary or Austria? What was the effect of Christianity in Switzerland, in Holland, in Scotland, in England, in America? Let us be honest. Could these countries have been worse without religion? Could they have been worse had they had any other religion than Christianity? Would Torquemada have been worse had he been a follower of Zoroaster? Would Calvin have been more bloodthirsty if he had believed in the religion of the South Sea Islanders? Would the Dutch have been more idiotic if they had denied the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost and worshipped the blessed Trinity of sausage, beer, and cheese? Would John Knox have been any worse had he deserted Christ and become a follower of Confucius? Take our own dear merciful Puritan fathers. What did Christianity do for them? They hated pleasure. On the door of life they hung the crape of death. They muffled all the bells of gladness. They made cradles by putting rockers on coffins. In the Puritan year there were 12 Decembers. They tried to do away with infancy and youth, with prattle of babes and the song of the morning. The religion of the Puritan was an unadulterated curse. The Puritan believed the Bible to be the Word of God, and this belief has always made those who held it cruel and wretched. Would the Puritan have been worse if he had adopted the religion of the North American Indians? Let me refer to just one fact showing the influence of a belief in the Bible on human beings. On the day of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, she was presented with the Geneva Bible by an old man representing time, with Truth standing by his side as a child. The Queen received the Bible, kissed it, and pledged herself to diligently read therein. In the dedication of this blessed Bible, the Queen was piously exhorted to put all the papists to the sword. In this incident we see the real spirit of Protestant lovers of the Bible. In other words, it was just as fiendish, just as infamous as the Catholic spirit. Has the Bible made the people of Georgia kind and merciful? Would the lynchers be more ferocious if they worshipped gods of wood and stone? How can mankind be reformed without religion? Religion has been tried, and in all countries, in all times, has failed. Religion has never made man merciful. Remember the Inquisition. What effect did religion have on slavery? What effect on Libby, Salisbury, and Andersonville? Religion has always been the enemy of science, of investigation and thought. Religion has never made man free. It has never made man moral, temperate, industrious, and honest. Are Christians more temperate, nearer virtuous, nearer honest than savages? Among savages, do we not find that their vices and cruelties are the fruits of their superstitions? To those who believe in the uniformity of nature, religion is impossible. Can we affect the nature and qualities of substance by prayer? Can we hasten or delay the tides by worship? Can we change winds by sacrifice? Will kneelings give us wealth? Can we cure disease by supplication? Can we add to our knowledge by ceremony? Can we receive virtue or honor as alms? Are not the facts in the mental world just as stubborn, just as necessarily produced, as the facts in the material world? Is not what we call mind just as natural as what we call body? Religion rests on the idea that nature has a master, and that this master will listen to prayer, that this master punishes and rewards, that he loves praise and flattery and hates the brave and free. Has man obtained any help from heaven? If we have a theory, we must have facts for the foundation. We must have cornerstones. We must not build on guesses, fancies, analogies, or inferences. The structure must have a basement. If we build, we must begin at the bottom. I have a theory, and I have 4 cornerstones. The first stone is that matter, substance, cannot be destroyed, cannot be annihilated. The second stone is that force cannot be destroyed, cannot be annihilated. The third stone is that matter and force cannot exist apart. No matter without force, no force without matter. The fourth stone is that that which cannot be destroyed could not have been created, that the indestructible is the uncreatable. If these cornerstones are facts, it follows as a necessity that matter and force are from and to eternity, that they can neither be increased nor diminished. it follows that nothing has been or can be created, that there never has been or can be a creator. It follows that there could not have been any intelligence, any design back of matter and force. There is no intelligence without force. There is no force without matter. Consequently, there could not by any possibility have been any intelligence, any force back of matter. It therefore follows that the supernatural does not and cannot exist. If these four cornerstones are facts, nature has no master. If matter and force are from and to eternity, it follows as a necessity that no God exists, that no God created or governs the universe, that no God exists who answers prayer, no God who succors the oppressed, no God who pities the sufferings of innocence, no God who cares for the slaves with scarred flesh, the mothers robbed of their babes, no God who rescues the tortured, and no God that saves a martyr from the flames. In other words, it proves that man has never received any help from heaven, that all sacrifices have been in vain, and that all prayers have died unanswered in the heedless air. I do not pretend to know. I say what I think. If matter and force have existed from eternity, it then follows that all that has been possible has happened. All that is possible is happening, and all that will be possible will happen. In the universe, there is no chance, no caprice. Every event has parents. That which has not happened could not. The present is the necessary product of all the past, the necessary cause of all the future. In the infinite chain there is, and there can be, no broken, no missing link. The form and motion of every star, the climate of every world, all forms of vegetable and animal life, all instinct, intelligence and conscience, all assertions and denials, all vices and virtues, all thoughts and dreams, all hopes and fears are necessities. Not one of the countless things and relations in the universe could have been different. If matter and force are from eternity, then we can say that man has no intelligent creator, that man was not the special creation. We now know, if we know anything, that Jehovah, the divine potter, did not mix and mold clay into the forms of man and women, and then breathe the breath of life into these forms. We now know that our first parents were not foreigners. We know that they were natives of this world, produced here, and that their life did not come from the breath of any god. We now know, if we know anything, that the universe is natural, and that men and women have been naturally produced. We now know our ancestors, our pedigree. We have the family tree. We have all the links of the chain, 26 links inclusive, from Mona to man. We did not get our information from inspired books. We have fossil facts and living forms. From the simplest creature, from blind sensation, from organism, from one vague want, to a single cell with a nucleus, to a hollow ball filled with fluid, to a cup with double walls, to a flat worm, to a something that begins to breathe, to an organism that has a spinal cord, to a link between the invertebrate to the vertebrate, to one that has a cranium, a house for a brain, to one with fins still on board, to one with fore and hinder fins, to the reptile mammalia, to the marsupials, to the lemurs, dwellers in trees, to the simia, to the pithecanthropy, and lastly, to man. We know the paths that life has travelled. We know the footsteps of advance. They have been traced. The last link has been found. For this we are indebted, more than to all others, to the greatest of biologists, Ernst Haeckel. We now believe that the universe is natural, and we deny the existence of supernatural. Reform. For thousands of years, men and women have been trying to reform the world. They have created gods and devils, heavens and hells. They have written sacred books, performed miracles, built cathedrals and dungeons. They have crowned and uncrowned kings and queens. They have tortured and imprisoned, flayed alive and burned. They have preached and prayed. They have tried promises and threats. They have coaxed and persuaded. They have preached and fought, and in countless ways have endeavored to make people honest, temperate, industrious and virtuous. They have built hospitals and asylums, universities and schools, and seem to have done their very best to make mankind better and happier, and yet they have not succeeded. Why have the reformers failed? I will tell them why. Ignorance, poverty, and vice are populating the world. The gutter is a nursery. People unable even to support themselves fill the tenements, the huts, and the hovels with children. They depend on the Lord, on luck, and charity. They are not intelligent enough to think about consequences or to feel responsibility. At the same time, they do not want children, because a child is a curse to them and to itself. The baby is not welcome, because it is a burden. These unwelcome children fill the jails and prisons, the asylums and hospitals, and they crowd the scaffolds. A few are rescued by chance or charity, but the great majority are failures. They become vicious, ferocious. They live by fraud and violence and bequeath their vices to their children. Against this inundation of vices, the forces of reform are helpless, and charity itself becomes an unconscious promoter of crime. Failure seems to be the trademark of nature. Why? Nature has no design, no intelligence. Nature produces without purpose, sustains without intention, and destroys without thought. Man has a little intelligence, and he should use it. Intelligence is the only lever capable of raising mankind. The real question is, can we prevent the ignorant, the poor, the vicious from filling the world with their children? Can we prevent the misery of ignorance and vice from emptying into the Mississippi of civilization? Must the world forever remain the victim of ignorant passion? Can the world be civilized to that degree that consequences will be taken into consideration by all? Why should men and women have children that they cannot take care of? Children that are a burden and curses? Why? Because they have more passion than intelligence, more passion than conscience, more passion than reason. You cannot reform these people with tracts and talk. You cannot reform these people with preach and creed. Passion is and always has been deaf. These weapons of reform are substantially useless. Criminals, tramps, beggars, and failures are increasing every day. The prisons, jails, poorhouses, and asylums are crowded. Religion is helpless. Law can punish, but it can neither reform criminals nor prevent crime. The tide of vice is rising. The war that is now being waged against the forces of evil is as hopeless as the battle of the fireflies against the darkness of the night. There is but one hope. Ignorance, poverty, and vice must stop populating the world. This cannot be done by moral suasion. This cannot be done by talk or example. This cannot be done by religion or by law, by priests or by hangmen. This cannot be done by force, physical or moral. To accomplish this, there is but one way. Science must make woman the owner, the mistress of herself. Science, the only possible savior of mankind, must put it in the power of women to decide for herself whether she will or will not become a mother. This is the solution of the whole question. This frees women. The babes that are then born will be welcome. They will be clasped with glad hands to happy breasts. They will fill homes with light and joy. Men and women who believe that slaves are purer, truer than the free, who believe that fear is a safer guide than knowledge, that only those are really good who obey the commands of others, and that ignorance is the soil in which the perfect perfumed flower of virtue grows, will with protesting hands hide their shocked faces. Men and women who think that light is the enemy of virtue, that purity dwells in darkness, that it is dangerous for human beings to know themselves and the facts in nature that affect their well-being, will be horrified at the thought of making intelligence the master of passion. But I look forward to the time when men and women, by reason of their knowledge of consequences, of the morality born of intelligence, will refuse to perpetuate disease and pain, will refuse to fill the world with failures. When that time comes, the prison walls will fall, the dungeons will be flooded with light, and the shadow of the scaffold will cease to curse the earth. Poverty and crime will be childless, the withered hands of want will not be stretched for alms, they will be dust. The whole world will be intelligent, virtuous, and free. Religion can never reform mankind, because religion is slavery. It is far better to be free, to leave the forts and barricades of fear, to stand erect and face the future with a smile. It is far better to give yourself sometimes to negligence, to drift with wave and tide, with the blind force of the world, to think and dream, to forget the chains and limitations of the breathing life, to forget purpose and object, to lounge in the picture gallery of the brain, to feel once more the clasp and kisses of the past, to bring life's morning back, to see again the forms and face of the dead, to paint fair pictures for the coming years, to forget all gods, their promises and threats, to feel within your veins life's joyous stream, and hear the martial music, the rhythmic beating of your fearless heart. And then to rouse yourself to do all useful things, to reach with thought and deed the ideal in your brain, to give your fancies wing, that they, like chemists' bees, may find art's nectar in the weeds of common things, to look with trained and steady eyes for facts, to find the subtle threads that join the distant with the now, to increase knowledge, to take burdens from the weak, to develop the brain, to defend the right, to make a palace for the soul. This is real religion. This is real worship. End of What is Religion by Robert G. Ingersoll. Recording by Herman Roskams in France, December 2013. End of the works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4.